Marcus Hale stood in the glass-walled boardroom of Sentinel Capital, the company that destroyed him 5 years ago. The executives who framed him stole his work and left him with nothing sat around the table, smug and comfortable in their power. They didn't recognize the quiet consultant they'd mockingly hired to fix their failing project. They had no idea he was the architect of their collapse. And they were about to learn that revenge, when patient enough, doesn't announce itself, it detonates. If you want to see how a man dismantled an empire piece by piece, stick around until the end. And if this story reaches you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far Marcus's journey travels. The apartment smelled like burnt toast and the kind of coffee that came in bulk from discount stores. Marcus Hale stood at the kitchen counter in a faded t-shirt with a growing hole near the collar, scraping blackened bread into the trash while his daughter, Emma, sat at the wobbly wooden table doing homework. She was 7, small for her age, with dark hair she'd pulled into a messy ponytail that morning, and eyes that saw too much for someone who should still believe in easy answers. "Dad, my teacher says we need to bring something for show and tell on Friday," Emma said, without looking up from her math worksheet. Her pencil scratched against the paper, numbers arranged in crooked rows. Marcus poured coffee into a chipped mug that had once said "World's Best Dad" before the dishwasher wore half the letters away. "What kind of something?" "Something that tells a story about our family." She chewed on the eraser, frowning at a subtraction problem, like a trophy or a picture or something cool. He stared into the coffee, watching steam curl upward in the weak morning light filtering through curtains that didn't quite close all the way. 5 years ago, his office had been on the 43rd floor of the Sentinel Capital Tower downtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a view that stretched across the city like he owned it. He'd had awards then, patents with his name engraved in brass, photos of him shaking hands with CEOs and politicians, the kind of images that showed up in business magazines under headlines about innovation and the future of finance. Now he had a one-bedroom apartment in a building where the heat worked 3 days out of 7, and the neighbors on the floor above fought loud enough to rattle dishes in the cabinets. The carpet in the hallway smelled like cigarettes and cleaning chemicals that never quite masked the underlying rot. "We'll think of something," Marcus said, his voice flat. Emma looked at him then, and he could see the question forming behind her eyes. The one about why they lived like this when other kids' parents had cars that weren't held together with duct tape and hope. Houses with actual yards instead of a parking lot view. She was smart enough not to ask. Too smart, maybe. That awareness in a 7-year-old felt like something Marcus had stolen from her just by being her father. "Finish your homework," he said. "I've got a shift at 6. She nodded and went back to her worksheet, and Marcus turned away before she could see his expression. The warehouse job was the kind of brutal that settled into your bones and stayed there. 10-hour shifts on concrete floors that made your knees ache and your back scream by hour 8. Moving boxes, scanning inventory barcodes, stacking pallets according to a system designed by someone who'd clearly never actually done the work themselves. Taking orders from a 23-year-old shift supervisor named Derek, who called him old man and thought it was the height of comedy. Marcus was 32. He didn't argue, didn't correct Derek when he got the terminology wrong or made mistakes on the logistics reports, didn't offer suggestions even when he watched the entire operation hemorrhage efficiency in ways that would have made him twitch back when he actually cared about optimization. He clocked in at 6, worked until 4 in the morning, clocked out. Invisible. Forgettable. Just another body in a yellow safety vest moving boxes from point A to point B. Exactly how he needed to be. But tonight, something was different. Marcus was stacking pallets near the loading dock, the industrial fans doing nothing to cut the humid air that smelled like cardboard and diesel fumes, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. Not the smartphone Emma used for emergencies, but the burner he kept separate, a cheap prepaid thing he paid for in cash at convenience stores. The screen showed a text from a number he recognized, even though it wasn't saved in his contacts. They took the bait. He read it once, twice, then deleted it and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Around him, forklifts beeped their reverse warnings and workers shouted over the noise of conveyor belts moving packages toward waiting trucks. No one looked at him. No one ever looked at him. Marcus allowed himself the smallest smile, just a twitch at the corner of his mouth that lasted maybe 2 seconds, before he went back to stacking pallets like nothing had happened. 5 years earlier, Marcus Hale had been someone who mattered, He'd built the algorithmic trading system that made Sentinel Capital billions. Not millions, billions with a B. The kind of money that showed up in quarterly earnings reports and made shareholders send champagne to the executive floor. An AI-driven platform that could analyze market patterns across 17 different exchanges simultaneously, executing trades in microseconds, exploiting arbitrage opportunities that disappeared almost as fast as they appeared. Marcus had been the architect, the brain behind the machine, and everyone at Sentinel knew it. Richard Garvin, the CEO, had shaken his hand at the annual company gala and called him the future of this firm in front of 300 people. That was December. By March, they'd destroyed him. The accusation came on a Tuesday morning. Insider trading, securities fraud, falsification of trade data. The kind of charges that didn't just end careers, they burned them to ash and scattered the remains. Federal agents showed up at his office at 7:47 a.m. with a warrant and started boxing up his computer equipment while his coworkers watched from the hallway. His bank accounts were frozen by noon, his keycard access revoked by 1. By the end of the week, his face was on the evening news, and Sentinel Capital's PR team was calling him a rogue employee who'd acted alone, a brilliant mind corrupted by greed. Marcus had tried to fight it. He'd hired a lawyer with the last of his accessible savings, a guy named Patterson who wore suits that looked expensive until you noticed the frayed cuffs. Gathered evidence. Prepared a defense. Built timelines that showed he couldn't have executed the trades they were accusing him of because he'd been in meetings, on camera, with a dozen witnesses. But Sentinel had something Marcus didn't. Unlimited resources and a legal team that knew exactly how to bury people under procedural delays and discovery motions. The case never went to trial. They offered him a deal, sign an NDA, accept a settlement that would keep him out of prison, and disappear. The alternative was a decade-long legal battle he couldn't afford that would end with him in a federal facility anyway. Marcus signed. He lost everything. The house in the suburbs with the good school district. The career he'd spent his entire adult life building. The respect of everyone who'd ever worked with him. Emma's mother, his ex-wife Claire, had already left 2 years before the scandal, taking the last pieces of what they'd tried to build together, but even she looked at him differently after the headlines broke. Like he was contagious. Like failure was something that spread through proximity. The only thing Marcus kept was Emma. Joint custody had become full custody when Claire moved to Seattle with her new husband, a dentist named Brad, who drove a Lexus, and decided a 7-year-old was too complicated to fit into their new life. So Emma stayed with Marcus, and Marcus tried to figure out how to be a father when he could barely figure out how to be a person anymore. He worked jobs that didn't ask questions, paid rent in cash when he could, kept his head down and his mouth shut, became the kind of man people's eyes slid past without registering, and in the spaces between survival, he started planning. Emma was asleep by the time Marcus got home from his shift at 4:37 a.m. He checked on her. She'd kicked off her blanket again, sprawled across the air mattress in the living room, and pulled it back up to her chin. She didn't stir. She'd always been a heavy sleeper, which Marcus counted as one of the few small mercies in their situation. At least she didn't wake up every time he came home smelling like sweat and warehouse dust. He stood there for a moment, watching her breathe, then went to the second bedroom. The apartment was technically a one-bedroom, but the second room barely qualified. It was more of a large closet, maybe 8 feet by 10, with no windows and a door that locked from the inside. Emma slept in the living room on an air mattress because Marcus had claimed this space for something else. Inside, he locked the door behind him and pulled the blackout curtain across the doorframe. Then he sat down at a desk made from a sheet of plywood balanced on filing cabinets, surrounded by monitors he'd built from parts bought at electronics recyclers and pawn shops. The screens flickered to life, casting blue light across his face. Marcus had spent 5 years doing exactly 2 things: surviving and preparing. The survival part was obvious: work whatever job would have him, pay the bills, keep Emma fed and clothed and in school. But the preparation was quieter, deeper. He'd rebuilt his technical skills in fragments stolen from exhaustion, learning new programming languages through free online courses he watched at 3 a.m., studying cybersecurity frameworks, tracking the people who destroyed him with the patience of someone who had nothing but time and rage. He needed to know how they did it, how they'd framed him so perfectly that even Patterson, his own lawyer, had moments where Marcus could see doubt creeping into his expression. And once he understood the mechanism, He needed to know how to reverse it, how to dismantle them with the same precision they'd used to dismantle him. Sentinel Capital had thrived in his absence. Under Richard Garvin's leadership, the company had more than doubled in size. New offices in Singapore and London, new acquisitions, smaller firms absorbed and stripped for parts, new algorithmic trading systems that were, Marcus knew from his monitoring, built directly on the foundation of his stolen work. They'd rebranded his platform, filed fresh patents with different names in the author fields, and paraded it as their innovation. But Marcus had left himself insurance. Backdoors in the original code, access points buried so deep in the architecture that even the engineers currently maintaining the system didn't know they existed. He'd built them in layers, hidden behind legitimate functions, disguised as error-handling protocols and diagnostic tools. He wasn't hacking, not technically. He was walking through doors he'd installed himself 5 years ago when he'd still believed the people he worked for had his back. The first monitor displayed Sentinel's internal communications, emails, chat logs, meeting notes. Marcus had spent 2 years mapping their network infrastructure, identifying vulnerabilities, understanding their operational hierarchy. The second monitor showed personnel files he'd slowly accumulated, building profiles on everyone from executive leadership down to mid-level managers. The third tracked financial transactions, following money as it moved through accounts both legitimate and otherwise. Tonight's text, they took the bait, referred to a job posting Marcus had planted 3 weeks earlier. A fake consultancy firm offering forensic auditing services for financial systems, targeted specifically at mid-level executives who thought they were smart enough to game the system without getting caught. Someone at Sentinel had applied. Marcus opened the encrypted folder where he'd stored the application. Daniel Chen, Vice President of Strategic Development. 38 years old, Princeton MBA. 3 years at Sentinel. His official record was spotless, performance reviews that glowed, projects delivered on time and under budget, the kind of resume that looked like a highway to the C-suite. Marcus knew better. Chen had been in the room when they'd framed him. Not the architect, that honor belonged to Garvin and his inner circle, but a willing participant. Someone who'd nodded along when they'd decided Marcus was the perfect fall guy. Chen's application to the fake consultancy included references, detailed work history, and a resume polished to a mirror shine. What Chen didn't know was that the consultancy didn't exist. It was a honeypot, designed to extract information while making the target feel like they were the ones being clever. Better still, Chen had included attachments, internal performance reviews, project summaries, portions of Sentinel's current strategic plan that he clearly thought would make him look impressive. Idiots always overcompensated when they were trying to land something they thought might be their big break. Marcus copied everything to an encrypted external drive, then scrubbed the digital trail that would lead back to the fake posting. He'd take the site down tomorrow, let it disappear like it had never existed. One piece at a time. That was how you built a case. That was how you destroyed people who thought they were untouchable. Morning came brutal and fast. Marcus had maybe slept 2 hours, his head full of code and planning, and when his alarm went off at 7, he felt like he'd been hit by something heavy. Emma was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal from a bowl that didn't match any of their other dishes, her backpack sitting ready by the door. "You look tired," she said, matter of fact. "I'm fine." "You always say that." She spooned cereal into her mouth, watching him. "Are you fine, or are you just saying it?" Marcus poured coffee and sat across from her, trying to make his face do something that looked normal. Emma had his eyes. Dark, sharp, impossible to lie to. Claire used to say Emma could see through people, and Marcus had never found evidence to the contrary. She'd figured out they were broke before he'd said a word about it. She'd stopped asking for things she knew he couldn't afford without him ever having to tell her no. "I'm tired," he admitted, "but I'm okay. Promise." She seemed to accept this, or at least decided not to push it. "I found something for show and tell." Marcus looked up. "Yeah?" Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out a small wooden box about the size of a paperback book with brass hinges that had tarnished to green. Marcus recognized it immediately, his father's old watch box, the one he'd kept in the back of the closet because he couldn't bring himself to throw it away, but also couldn't stand to look at it most days. "Emma, that's—" "I know it's yours," she said quickly, the words tumbling out like she was afraid he'd say no if she didn't get them all out fast enough. "But you told me Grandpa gave it to you before he died, right?" And it's got his initials carved on the top. That's a story. That counts. Marcus stared at the box. His father had died when Marcus was 16, a heart attack at 52 that no one saw coming. The watch inside had stopped working maybe a decade ago, and Marcus had always meant to get it repaired but never had. First it was too expensive, then it was too painful, and eventually it became just another broken thing in a collection of broken things. "You can use it," Marcus said quietly. Emma's whole face brightened, and she carefully put the box back in her backpack like it was made of glass. "Thanks, Dad. Just don't lose it." "I won't, I promise." She finished her cereal and grabbed her backpack, and Marcus drove her to school in a car that made concerning noises whenever he hit 40 miles per hour. They didn't talk much during the ride. Emma hummed something she'd probably heard on the radio, and Marcus tried not to think about the fact that he had a warehouse shift in 2 hours, and his body already felt like it had been through a meat grinder. "Have a good day," he said when they pulled up to the drop-off zone. Emma unbuckled her seatbelt but didn't get out right away. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "When you were my age, what did you want to be when you grew up?" The question caught him off guard. He looked at her, at this small person who'd gotten stuck with him as a father, and tried to remember being 7. "I wanted to build things, solve problems, make things work better than they did before." "Do you still want that?" Marcus thought about the monitors in the locked room, the files building on his hard drives, the plan taking shape piece by careful piece. "Yeah," he said, "I still want that." Emma nodded like this confirmed something important, then climbed out of the car and disappeared into the crowd of kids heading toward the school entrance. Marcus sat there for a moment after she was gone, then drove to work. The warehouse shift that day was somehow worse than usual. Derek, the supervisor, was in a mood about something, probably his girlfriend, based on the angry phone conversation Marcus overheard near the break room, and took it out on everyone within shouting distance. Marcus spent most of the morning hauling pallets in the back lot, where the sun turned the asphalt into something that felt like standing on a griddle. By lunch, his shirt was soaked through and his shoulders burned. He ate alone in his car, windows down to catch whatever breeze existed, scrolling through news on his phone. Sentinel Capital was trending. Another acquisition, this time some tech startup in Boston that specialized in machine learning applications for market analysis. The article praised Richard Garvin's visionary leadership and called him one of the most innovative minds in modern finance. Marcus stared at Garvin's photo, the same practiced smile, the same expensive suit, and felt nothing. He'd burned through anger years ago. What was left was colder, more useful. He deleted the news app and stared at the warehouse, watching workers stream in and out of the loading dock. In another life, he would have been analyzing their efficiency, building models to optimize workflow, saving the company money while making everyone's job easier. Now he just moved boxes and kept his head down. His phone buzzed. The burner, not his regular phone. A new message from the same number as before. "Meeting confirmed. Thursday, 2 p.m. Downtown. Coffee shop on 5th. Come alone." Marcus read it 3 times, memorizing the details, then deleted it. He had 2 days to prepare. Thursday morning, Marcus called in sick to the warehouse for the first time in 8 months. Derek sounded annoyed but didn't push it, probably because Marcus never called out, which meant he'd built up just enough credibility to spend it on one absence. He spent an hour getting ready, putting on clothes he hadn't worn in years. A button-down shirt that was slightly too big now because he'd lost weight since the last time he'd dressed like someone with an office job. Slacks that were wrinkled even after he'd tried to smooth them. A tie that still fit if he didn't breathe too deep. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Somewhere between who he'd been and who he'd become. Not quite either one. Emma was at school. He'd arranged for her to go to an after-school program today, which cost $20 he didn't really have but needed. This meeting was too important to rush. The coffee shop was in the business district downtown, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and Edison bulbs and coffee that cost more than Marcus made in an hour of warehouse work. He arrived at 1:47 p.m., ordered a black coffee he couldn't afford to add anything to, and sat near the window where he could watch the door. At 2:03 p.m., a man in a tailored charcoal suit walked in. Mid-40s, graying at the temples in a way that looked distinguished rather than old. The kind of posture that came from never being told no by anyone who mattered. Marcus didn't recognize him from the personnel files, which meant he was outside Sentinel's direct employment structure. The man ordered something complicated with foam and extra shots, then walked directly to Marcus's table and sat down without asking permission. "You're Hale?" he said. "That's right." The man looked him over with the kind of assessment you'd give a used car you were considering buying, clearly unimpressed. "I'll be honest, I wasn't sure you'd show. Your resume's a little sparse." Marcus sipped his coffee. "I've been out of the industry for a while." 5 years, the man said. "That's a long time. What have you been doing?" "Consulting, freelance work, keeping my head down." The man leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You worked at Sentinel." It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded. "And you left under complicated circumstances." Marcus met his eyes and didn't blink. "I was set up, took the fall for people who knew how to cover their tracks better than I knew how to defend myself." It was the truth, filtered through the lens of what this man wanted to hear. A narrative about someone who'd been burned, humbled, and desperate enough for a second chance that he'd work cheap and keep his mouth shut. The man's expression softened slightly, like he'd just confirmed something he'd suspected. "I'm Jonathan Pierce," he said, "senior partner at Graviton Ventures. We've got portfolio connections to several major financial firms, including Sentinel. I'm not here to dig up your past. What happened to you is between you and them. But I need someone who understands algorithmic trading systems from the inside, someone who can audit a project without leaving fingerprints. Discreet work, off the books." "Why me?" Marcus asked. "Because you're hungry," Pierce said simply, "and because nobody's looking at you. You're not on anyone's radar anymore." "That's useful." Marcus let the silence sit for a moment, watching Pierce, reading the micro-expressions that most people didn't know they were broadcasting. This wasn't about trust. This was about expendability. Pierce needed someone he could burn if the job went sideways. "What's the project?" Marcus asked. Pierce slid a manila folder across the table, glancing around first to make sure no one was watching. "Sentinel's rolling out a new platform. Algorithmic arbitrage across international markets. Big money, potentially billions in annual returns. But there's a problem. Someone's skimming. Small amounts, fractions of a percent, but consistent. We need to know who and how without alerting the thief that we're looking." Marcus opened the folder and felt something cold settle in his chest. The documents inside were about his own system, the one he'd built 5 years ago. They'd updated it, added features, changed some of the architecture, but the core was still his work. He recognized his own code in the technical diagrams like someone recognizing their own handwriting. They'd stolen his creation and now they were hiring him to fix it. He kept his face neutral, professional. "Timeline? 2 weeks, Pierce said. "Can you handle it?" Marcus closed the folder and looked up. "Yeah, I can handle it." Pierce stood, adjusting his cufflinks. Real gold, Marcus noticed. "I'll send you the access codes tonight. Secure channel." "Don't make me regret this, Hale." "I won't." Pierce left without shaking hands, walking out into the downtown foot traffic and disappearing within seconds. Marcus sat alone with the folder and his cooling coffee. And for the first time in 5 years, he allowed himself to feel something close to satisfaction. They'd invited him back in. They'd opened the door themselves. Now he just had to walk through it and burn the entire building down from the inside. That night, after Emma was asleep, Marcus sat in the locked room and opened the email from Pierce. The access codes were real. Limited clearance, read-only on most systems, but enough to get inside Sentinel's network from a legitimate entry point. It was more than Marcus had dared hope for. With these credentials, he wouldn't have to rely solely on his back doors. He could operate in the open, right under their noses, and they'd never suspect because they'd invited him. He started mapping the current system, tracing data flows, identifying where the skimming was happening. It didn't take long to find it. Whoever was stealing wasn't particularly sophisticated. They'd set up a series of shell accounts that shaved tiny percentages off high-volume trades and routed the money through what they probably thought was a complex web, but was really just mildly inconvenient to follow. The trail led to Daniel Chen, the same VP who'd applied to Marcus's fake consultancy, the same man who'd been in the room when they'd framed him. Chen was stealing from the company that had helped him destroy Marcus, which would have been funny if it wasn't so predictable. Of course, Chen was a thief. People who'd participate in framing an innocent man weren't exactly overburdened with ethics. Marcus documented everything: screenshots, transaction records, the routing numbers for Chen's shell accounts. He built a clean professional report that would make Pierce look good for hiring him and make Chen look like exactly what he was. But then Marcus went deeper. If Chen was stealing, chances were he wasn't the only one. Marcus started following other transaction patterns, looking for similar signatures. He found 3 more executives running the same scheme with minor variations. All of them people who'd been at Sentinel during Marcus's tenure. All of them complicit, to varying degrees, in what had happened to him. And then he found the main account. It took him 4 hours of tracing, following money through layers of corporate structures and offshore holdings. But when he finally reached the end of the chain, he sat back in his chair and laughed. Actually laughed, a sound so unfamiliar in the small room that it startled him. Richard Garvin's name was on the account. Not directly, Garvin was too smart for that, but close enough that any competent forensic accountant would make the connection within a day. The CEO of Sentinel Capital, the man who'd stood on a stage and called Marcus the future of the firm, had been skimming money from his own company for at least 3 years. Marcus copied everything, every transaction, every email that referenced the accounts, even obliquely. Every piece of evidence that would prove Sentinel Capital wasn't just complicit in destroying him, they were a criminal enterprise from the top down. He saved it all to multiple encrypted drives, backed up to cloud storage accounts registered under names that didn't exist, buried behind so many layers of security that even the NSA would need a few days to crack it. Then he prepared the report for Pierce. Clean, professional, identifying Chen as the primary culprit with enough evidence to prosecute. He didn't mention the others. Not yet. That would come later, piece by careful piece. This was just the first move. Marcus sent the email at 3:47 a.m., then sat back and stared at the monitors until the sun started coming up. Meg. Emma's show and tell was Friday afternoon. Marcus took a half shift at the warehouse, worked until noon, then drove to her school with sweat still drying on his back. He sat in the back of her classroom on a chair designed for someone half his size, surrounded by other parents who looked like they belonged there. People in clean clothes who'd never had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying groceries. Emma stood at the front of the classroom, holding the wooden watch box in both hands, like it might escape if she wasn't careful. "This was my grandpa's," she said, her voice small but steady. "He gave it to my dad before he died. The watch inside doesn't work anymore, but my dad still keeps it because it reminds him that some things are worth fixing, even when they're broken." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't told her to say that. She'd come up with it on her own. Emma opened the box carefully, showing the class the tarnished watch inside. The brass had oxidized to green in places, and the crystal was scratched, but you could still read the numbers on the face. "My dad says you don't throw things away just because they stop working. You figure out what went wrong, and then you fix them. And sometimes fixing something makes it better than it was before." The teacher smiled warmly. The other kids clapped in that automatic way children did when prompted. Emma closed the box and sat down, glancing back at Marcus, and he gave her a small nod. After class, they walked to the car together. Emma clutched the watch box against her chest like treasure. "Did I do okay?" she asked. "You did great. I didn't know if the part about fixing things was too weird. It sounded strange when I practiced it last night." Marcus unlocked the car and Emma climbed into the back seat. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the door looking at her. It wasn't weird, it was perfect. She smiled and Marcus got in and started driving home. They stopped at a grocery store on the way back because the fridge was down to condiments and half a gallon of milk. Emma walked beside him pushing the cart, and Marcus did the mental math on every item before he put it in. Chicken thighs instead of breasts because they were cheaper per pound. Store-brand cereal. The bread from the day-old rack. At the register, the total came to $43.17. Marcus paid in cash and tried not to think about the fact that he'd spent $20 on Emma's after-school program yesterday so he could meet with Pierce. Numbers that used to mean nothing now felt like life and death. They got home and Marcus made dinner, the chicken with rice and frozen vegetables that cost 99 cents a bag. Emma set the table without being asked, and they ate together while she told him about her day. There'd been a fight at recess. Someone had brought cupcakes for their birthday. Her teacher was starting a new unit on fractions. Marcus listened and tried to be present, but part of his mind was already in the locked room, thinking about the files, the evidence, the plan that was finally starting to take shape after 5 years of waiting. After dinner, Emma did her homework at the kitchen table while Marcus washed dishes. The hot water took 3 minutes to warm up, and by the time he finished, his hands were pink and wrinkled. "Dad?" Emma said from behind him. He turned. She was standing there with her math book closed, chewing on her bottom lip the way she did when she was working up the courage to ask something difficult. "What's up? Are we going to be okay?" The question hit him harder than it should have. Marcus dried his hands on a dish towel that had a stain he couldn't identify and sat down at the table across from her. "What do you mean?" "I mean like—" She gestured vaguely at the apartment, at everything. "Is it always going to be like this? Are things going to get better?" Marcus could have lied, could have told her easy things that would make her feel safe even if they weren't true, but Emma deserved more than that. "I'm working on it," he said. "I know it's hard right now. I know you shouldn't have to worry about this stuff, but I promise you, things are going to change. It's going to take time, but they will." "How much time?" "I don't know yet, but not forever." Emma studied his face, those sharp eyes looking for cracks in the truth. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded and went back to her homework. Marcus sat there for another minute, watching her pencil move across the page, then got up and went to take a shower in a bathroom where the grout had turned black with mold he couldn't afford to fix properly. Pierce called Monday morning while Marcus was unloading a truck at the warehouse. Marcus stepped outside to take the call, standing in the loading dock where diesel smoke hung in the air, thick enough to taste. "We've got Chen," Pierce said without preamble. "The board reviewed your report over the weekend. Garvin's pissed, but he'll get over it. You did good work, Hale." "Thanks. Chen's being terminated today. We're bringing in the SEC to handle the criminal side. Your name won't come up. We're keeping you out of it entirely, as agreed." "Appreciated. There might be more projects coming your way. You interested?" Marcus watched a forklift maneuver a pallet through a door that was 6 inches too narrow for comfort. The driver was going to clip the frame if he didn't adjust his angle. Marcus didn't say anything. "Yeah," he told Pierce. "I'm interested." "Good. I'll be in touch." The line went dead. Marcus stood in the loading dock for another moment, then went back inside. Derek was yelling at someone about improper stacking procedures. The conveyor belts rattled. Everything smelled like cardboard and sweat. Marcus clocked back in and returned to work like nothing had happened. But that night, after Emma was asleep, he sat in the locked room and opened a new file on his computer. He titled it Phase 2 and started typing. Chen would be fired, probably prosecuted. The board would think they'd found their thief and solved their problem. Security would tighten for a few weeks, then relax again once they decided the crisis was over. They had no idea the real threat had been there all along, watching, documenting, building a case that would bring down not just one VP but the entire executive structure. Marcus worked until 4 in the morning, mapping out the next steps. Pierce would call again. People like him always needed someone they could trust to handle their dirty work, and Marcus had just proven he was reliable. That would give him more access, more opportunities to dig deeper into Sentinel's infrastructure. He pulled up Richard Garvin's file and stared at the photo. Same practice smile, same expensive suit, the man who'd shaken his hand and called him the future of the firm. "You have no idea what's coming," Marcus said to the empty room. Then he saved his work, encrypted the files, and went to sleep for 2 hours before Emma's alarm went off and another day started. Pierce's second call came 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning while Marcus was sorting damaged inventory in the warehouse basement. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, half of them burned out, leaving pools of shadow between metal shelving units that stretched to the ceiling. Marcus's phone vibrated against his hip, and he pulled it out to see Pierce's number on the screen. "Hale," he answered, wedging the phone between his shoulder and ear while he continued scanning barcodes. "I've got another project for you," Pierce said. No greeting, no small talk. Marcus was starting to understand that was how Pierce operated. Everything transactional, stripped down to pure utility. Bigger than the Chen situation, more sensitive. Marcus stopped scanning. "I'm listening." "Not over the phone. Can you meet tomorrow? Same place? 2 o'clock. "I'll be there." The line went dead before Marcus could say anything else. He stood there in the basement with boxes of damaged goods surrounding him like a cardboard maze and felt something shift in his chest. This was it. This was the opening he'd been waiting for. Chen's termination had been public enough to make waves. The SEC had opened an investigation, financial news outlets had run stories about internal corruption at Sentinel Capital, and the board had scrambled to reassure investors that the problem was isolated and contained. Marcus had watched it unfold from the outside, anonymous and invisible, exactly as planned. Now Pierce needed him again, which meant Sentinel's problems ran deeper than one stealing VP, and they were starting to realize it. Marcus finished his shift, clocked out at midnight, and drove home through empty streets where traffic lights blinked yellow, and the only other cars belonged to people working jobs that didn't exist during daylight hours. Emma was asleep when he got back, sprawled across her air mattress with a library book open on her chest. He moved the book to the floor and pulled her blanket up, then locked himself in the second bedroom and started preparing. The meeting tomorrow would determine how much access he could get, how deep into Sentinel's infrastructure he could dig before someone noticed. He needed to be sharp, needed to make Pierce believe he was exactly what they needed, competent enough to solve their problems, but desperate enough not to ask inconvenient questions. Marcus worked until his eyes burned and the numbers on the screen started blurring together, then slept for 4 hours before Emma's alarm pulled him back to consciousness. The next day crawled. Marcus called in sick to the warehouse again. Derek sounded annoyed but didn't push back, and spent the morning going through his files, refreshing his memory on Sentinel's current structure. The company had reorganized after Chen's termination, shifting responsibilities, closing gaps. But reorganization created its own vulnerabilities. New people in positions they didn't fully understand yet, communication breakdowns, opportunities. He dressed in the same clothes he'd worn to the first meeting with Pierce, noticed the shirt collar was fraying, and decided it didn't matter. Looking too polished would raise questions. He needed to look like someone grateful for the work, not someone with options. The coffee shop was less crowded this time. Marcus arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the same spot by the window, watching business people hurry past outside with phones pressed to their ears and expressions that suggested the world would end if they didn't make their next meeting. Pierce walked in at 2:04, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months. He ordered his complicated coffee, sat down across from Marcus, and got straight to it. "The Chen situation opened a door we weren't expecting," Pierce said, keeping his voice low. "When the board started digging into his activities, they found irregularities in other departments. Nothing conclusive yet, but enough to make people nervous." "What kind of irregularities?" Marcus asked. "Transaction patterns that don't match approved trading strategies. Money moving through accounts that shouldn't be active. Small things individually, but they add up." Pierce leaned forward. "The board wants a complete audit. Every trading system, every account, every executive with financial access. They want to know if Chen was an isolated case or if there's a bigger problem." Marcus kept his face neutral, but internally he was already 3 steps ahead. This was better than he'd hoped. A full audit meant legitimate access to everything. No more operating through back doors and hoping he didn't trigger security alerts. They were inviting him to look at the entire operation. "That's a massive project," Marcus said. "How much time are we talking?" 3 months, maybe 4. "You'd be working directly with the board's oversight committee. Reporting to me, but your findings go straight to the top." Pierce pulled a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table. "The compensation reflects the scope. Take a look." Marcus opened the folder. The contract inside listed a fee that made his throat tight. $60,000 for 4 months of work. More than he'd made in the past 2 years combined. Enough to move Emma out of that apartment. Enough to stop working at the warehouse. Enough to breathe. But that wasn't why his hands shook slightly as he read through the terms. This contract gave him everything. Complete access to Sentinel's systems. Authorization to review any file, any account, any communication he deemed relevant to the investigation. The legal authority to demand cooperation from every employee up to and including C-suite executives. They were handing him the keys to their kingdom. "There's one condition," Pierce said, watching him read. "Everything you find stays confidential until the final report. You don't talk to anyone outside the oversight committee. You don't share preliminary findings. And when this is done, you sign another NDA that makes the first one look like a suggestion." "Understood," Marcus said. "I need you to really understand, Hale. If you leak anything, to the press, to regulators, to anyone, they will destroy you. Again. And this time there won't be a settlement. They'll make sure you end up in a cell." Marcus looked up from the contract and met Pierce's eyes. I spent 5 years in the wilderness because of what they did to me the first time. You think I'm going to risk that? I just want to do the work and get paid. Pierce studied him for a long moment, then nodded. When can you start? Monday. Good. Pierce stood, adjusting his suit jacket. I'll have credentials and office access sent to your email by Friday. Don't make me regret trusting you with this. He left without another word, and Marcus sat alone with the contract, reading through it 3 more times to make sure it was real. $60,000. 4 months. Complete access. He signed it right there in the coffee shop, took a photo of every page with his phone, then slid it back into the folder and finished his cold coffee. Outside, the city moved around him like he wasn't there, and Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Not hope, exactly. Something sharper. Something that tasted like vindication getting ready to happen. He drove home and found Emma already back from school, doing homework at the kitchen table. She looked up when he walked in. "You're home early," she said. "Yeah, had some business to take care of." Marcus set his keys on the counter and sat down across from her. "How was school?" "Fine. We had a fire drill and Tyler threw up in the cafeteria." She wrinkled her nose. "It was gross." "Sounds it." Emma went back to her worksheet, and Marcus watched her for a moment before speaking again. "I got a new job," he said. She looked up, eyes wide. "Really?" "Really. It's temporary, but it pays better. A lot better." "Does that mean we can move?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He'd thought about it during the drive home, running numbers in his head. 60,000 was enough to get them into a better place. Not extravagant, but stable. An apartment where the heat worked and Emma could have her own bedroom. "Maybe," Marcus said. "Let's see how it goes first, but things are going to get easier, I promise." Emma smiled, and Marcus felt the weight of that promise settle on his shoulders. He'd failed her in so many ways over the past 5 years. Failed to give her the life she deserved. Failed to be the father she needed. But maybe now he could start fixing that. Later that night, after Emma was asleep, Marcus sat in the locked room and stared at the contract on his screen. The implications were massive. 4 months of legitimate access meant he could document everything without raising suspicion. Every corrupt transaction, every falsified report, every piece of evidence that proved Sentinel was rotten from the inside out. And when he was done, he wouldn't just clear his name. He'd burn the entire structure to the ground. Marcus opened a new file and started planning. He'd need to be careful. Too aggressive, and they'd realize what he was doing. Too slow, and he might miss the window. The investigation had to look thorough, but normal. He'd find some legitimate issues, every company this size had them, and report those while quietly building the real case in parallel. He worked until 3 in the morning, then slept with his phone next to the pillow in case Pierce called again. Friday came and the credentials arrived as promised. Marcus now had an employee badge, network access, and a temporary office on the 37th floor of the Sentinel Capitol Tower. Not the executive floor where he used to work, but close enough that he'd be in the same building as the people who'd destroyed him. Monday morning, Marcus woke up at 5:30 and couldn't fall back asleep. He showered, dressed in the best clothes he owned, still worn, still cheap, but clean, and made breakfast for Emma. She ate her cereal while he tried to keep his hands from shaking. "Are you nervous?" Emma asked. "A little." "You'll do great, Dad. You always do." The blind faith in her voice made his chest hurt. "Thanks, kiddo." He dropped her at school, then drove downtown through morning traffic that moved like sludge. The Sentinel Capitol Tower rose 47 floors into the sky, all glass and steel and the kind of architecture designed to make you feel small. Marcus parked in the visitor section of the underground garage. His credentials didn't include parking privileges yet, and rode the elevator up with a dozen other people who looked like they belonged there. The 37th floor was quieter than he remembered the executive levels being, mostly conference rooms and temporary offices for consultants and auditors. Marcus found his assigned space, a windowless room barely bigger than a closet with a desk, a chair, and a computer that looked about 3 years old. Someone had left a stack of file boxes in the corner with a note that said "Start here" in handwriting he didn't recognize. He sat down, logged into the computer with his new credentials, and felt the system accept him. Marcus Hale, external auditor, authorized for financial review. 5 years ago, they'd scrubbed his access in under an hour. Now they were welcoming him back. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so perfect. Marcus spent the first day reviewing the files in the boxes: transaction records, trading logs, compliance reports, all legitimate audit material. He took notes, built spreadsheets, did exactly what they'd expect from someone conducting a thorough investigation. But during his lunch break, sitting alone in the office with the door closed, he logged into the deeper systems. The ones his credentials weren't supposed to reach but did anyway, because Marcus had built back doors into this network before it even knew it needed security. The architecture had changed in 5 years, but the bones were the same. His code was still there, buried in subsystems and error handlers that no one had thought to examine too closely. Marcus navigated through layers of security that weren't designed to stop someone who already knew the path, and within 20 minutes, he was looking at files that should have required executive clearance. He didn't copy anything yet. Too risky. Instead, he mapped the network, identifying what was where, building a mental model of how information flowed through Sentinel's infrastructure, where the valuable data lived, where the incriminating evidence was stored, where they kept the secrets that would destroy them if they ever got out. By the time his lunch break ended, Marcus had seen enough to know this was going to work. The next 3 weeks fell into a rhythm. Marcus would work his official audit during normal business hours, documenting legitimate findings and filing preliminary reports that showed he was making progress. Pierce checked in twice a week, asking questions, pushing for faster results. Marcus fed him enough information to stay valuable without revealing anything that mattered. And every day during lunch breaks and after hours when the floor emptied out, Marcus dug deeper into the systems. He found evidence of systematic fraud that went back 7 years. Insider trading coordinated across multiple executives. Client funds redirected into accounts that existed only on paper. A network of corruption so extensive that Marcus had to build custom databases just to track all the connections. Richard Garvin's name appeared everywhere. Not always directly, he was too smart for that, but the pattern was unmistakable. Money flowed toward accounts he controlled. Decisions got made that benefited his holdings. People who asked too many questions got reassigned, or fired, or, in Marcus's case, destroyed. Marcus documented everything with the patience of someone who'd spent 5 years waiting for exactly this opportunity. Emma noticed the change in him. He was home more now, making real money, able to buy groceries without calculating every item. They'd gone to an actual restaurant last weekend, nothing fancy, just a diner with burgers and milkshakes, but Emma had talked about it for days like it was the greatest thing that had ever happened. "Dad, can I ask you something?" she said one night while they were washing dishes together. "Sure." "Why did you stop working at places like this before?" Marcus scrubbed a plate and tried to figure out how to answer that. "It's complicated. Because of the bad stuff that happened." He looked at her surprised. They'd never talked about it directly. He'd assumed she was too young to understand, or that she'd forgotten the news coverage and the shame that had followed them like a shadow. "Yeah," Marcus said, "because of that." "But you didn't do anything wrong, did you?" "No, I didn't." Emma nodded like this confirmed something she'd already decided. "I knew you didn't. You're not like that." Marcus set down the plate and pulled her into a hug, and Emma wrapped her small arms around his waist and squeezed tight. "Thanks for believing me," he said quietly. "I always believe you." Later, alone in the locked room, Marcus stared at his monitors and thought about that conversation. Emma believed in him because she was 7 and he was her father, and children that age still thought parents were capable of anything. But someday she'd be older. Someday she'd ask harder questions and expect better answers. He needed to finish this, not just for revenge, though that was part of it. He needed to show her that broken things could be fixed, that people who knocked you down didn't get to win just because they had more money and better lawyers, that her father wasn't a failure. He was just someone who'd been playing a longer game than anyone realized. Marcus returned to work with renewed focus. Week 5 of the audit, and he was starting to make waves. His preliminary reports had identified enough legitimate issues that the board was taking notice. Nothing major yet, but enough to make executives nervous. People he'd never met were suddenly friendly in the hallways, offering to help with whatever he needed, asking casual questions about what he'd found so far. Marcus smiled and played harmless, just doing his job, just following the numbers. But in the background, he was building something bigger. Every piece of evidence got copied to encrypted drives he kept in a storage unit across town. Every incriminating email got saved in triplicate. Every connection between executives and fraudulent accounts got mapped and documented with timestamps and transaction records that would hold up in any court. He was 2 months into the audit when he found the files about himself. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Marcus was following a trail of suspicious transactions that led back to an archive server most people had probably forgotten existed. The files were old, 5 to 7 years, and poorly organized, which meant no one had bothered to secure them properly. Marcus opened a folder labeled Internal Affairs 2020 and started scrolling through documents. Then he stopped. His own name stared back at him from a memo dated 3 weeks before the accusations had gone public. The subject line read, "Contingency Planning, Hale Situation." Marcus's hands were shaking as he opened it. The memo was from Richard Garvin to 4 other executives, including Daniel Chen. It laid out in cold corporate language exactly how they were going to frame Marcus for crimes he hadn't committed. They'd identified him as the perfect fall guy months before the federal investigation started. They'd planted evidence in his accounts, falsified trade records to make it look like he'd been stealing, built an entire narrative designed to destroy him while protecting themselves. And they'd done it because Marcus had started asking questions about irregularities he'd noticed in the trading systems. Nothing major, just due diligence, the kind of thing any good engineer would do. But those questions had gotten too close to secrets Garvin needed to keep buried, so they'd eliminated the problem. Marcus read the memo 3 times, then sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling tiles. Part of him had always known, on some level, that the accusations were manufactured. But seeing it spelled out in black and white, seeing the casual way they discussed destroying his life like it was just another business decision, made something cold and sharp settle in his chest. He copied the file. Then he searched for more. By the end of the day, Marcus had found the entire archive. Dozens of emails and memos detailing exactly how they'd framed him. Who did what? When each piece of evidence was planted, how they'd coordinated with the federal investigators to make sure the case looked airtight. And buried in the middle of it all, he found something even worse. He wasn't the first. There'd been others before him. 3 other employees over the past decade who'd asked inconvenient questions or threatened to expose corruption. All of them had been systematically destroyed using variations of the same playbook. One had been accused of sexual harassment, fabricated complaints from women who'd been paid to lie. Another was framed for embezzlement. The third had simply been driven out through a coordinated campaign of workplace hostility until they quit. Sentinel Capital had turned destroying people into a standard operating procedure. Marcus copied everything, every file, every email, every piece of evidence that proved this wasn't just about him. This was institutional, criminal. The kind of thing that didn't just end careers. It sent people to prison for decades. When he finally logged off that night, it was almost 8 o'clock. The floor was empty, the building quiet except for the hum of HVAC systems and the distant sound of cleaning crews working other floors. Marcus packed his laptop, locked the office, and rode the elevator down to the garage. His car was one of 3 left in the visitor section. Marcus got in, started the engine, and sat there for a moment with his hands on the wheel, breathing. He had everything he needed now. Enough evidence to destroy Sentinel Capital completely. Enough to clear his name and put Garvin behind bars. Enough to make sure everyone who'd participated in what they'd done to him faced consequences that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But he couldn't use it yet. Too soon and they'd find a way to suppress it. Too aggressive and they'd activate their legal machine and bury him under motions and injunctions before the truth got out. He needed to be patient just a little longer. Finish the audit, file his official report, make them think they were safe, and then burn it all down when they weren't looking. Marcus drove home through dark streets, picked up dinner from a drive-thru because he was too exhausted to cook, and found Emma asleep on the couch with her homework scattered around her. He covered her with a blanket and ate cold fries alone at the kitchen table. His phone buzzed, a text from Pierce. "Need preliminary findings by Friday, board meeting next week." Marcus typed back, "You'll have them." He threw away the rest of his food and went to the locked room and worked until dawn, making sure his official audit looked thorough and professional and completely normal. The preliminary findings went to Pierce on Thursday. Marcus had identified 17 instances of policy violations, 9 cases of unauthorized trading activity, and enough procedural failures to make the board nervous without implicating anyone important. Small fish. The kind of problems that looked serious enough to justify his fee but wouldn't trigger panic. Pierce called an hour after receiving the report. "This is good work," he said. "The board's impressed. They want you at the meeting next Tuesday to present the findings." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "I'll be there." "Conference room on 47, 10 a.m. Dress appropriately." The line went dead. The 47th floor, executive level, where Richard Garvin's office was located, where the people who destroyed him made decisions that affected billions of dollars and thousands of lives. Marcus was going to walk right into their territory and look them in the eyes. He spent the weekend preparing. Not just the presentation. That was easy. He'd been building reports for longer than some of these executives had been in business, but preparing himself. 5 years of anger and patience and careful planning had been leading to this moment. He needed to be calm, controlled, give them no reason to suspect he was anything other than what they thought he was. Monday night, he tried on every piece of professional clothing he still owned and realized none of it fit right anymore. He'd lost weight, and the clothes hung on him wrong. Emma watched from the doorway while he struggled with a tie that wouldn't sit straight. "You look nervous," she said. "I am nervous." "Why? You're good at your job." Marcus looked at her reflection in the mirror. Sometimes being good at your job isn't enough. Sometimes you have to be good at making people believe you're on their side. "Are you on their side?" "No," Marcus said quietly. "I'm really not." Emma seemed to think about this, then walked over and adjusted his tie for him, her small fingers working the knot into place with surprising competence. "Mom taught me," she explained. Before she left, she said knowing how to tie a tie was important. "It is," Marcus agreed. "Are you going to be okay tomorrow?" He looked down at her, at this small person who'd been forced to grow up too fast because of his failures, and made himself smile. "Yeah, I'm going to be fine." Tuesday morning came clear and cold. Marcus dropped Emma at school, drove downtown, and parked in the visitor garage one last time. He rode the elevator to the 47th floor and stepped out into a world he'd been exiled from 5 years ago. The executive level was exactly as he remembered. Thick carpet that absorbed sound. Artwork on the walls that cost more than most people made in a year. Floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city into a landscape you looked down on rather than lived in. A receptionist directed him to the main conference room. Marcus walked down the hallway and tried to keep his breathing steady. The conference room had a table that seated 20. 15 executives were already there, talking in clusters, drinking coffee from cups with the Sentinel logo printed in silver. Marcus recognized some of them. Others were new since his time. And at the head of the table, reading something on a tablet, sat Richard Garvin, 5 years older. A little more gray in his hair. Same expensive suit. Same expression of a man who'd never had to doubt himself. Garvin looked up as Marcus entered, and for just a second their eyes met. There was no recognition in Garvin's face. None. He looked at Marcus the same way he'd look at any consultant brought in to do work that was beneath his attention, then went back to his tablet. Marcus sat down in the chair Pierce had indicated and set up his laptop while the room filled with the rest of the board. Jonathan Pierce arrived last, taking a seat near Garvin and nodding at Marcus to begin. Marcus stood, connected his laptop to the room's presentation system, and pulled up his slides. "Thank you for having me," he said, his voice steady. "I've spent the past 2 months conducting a comprehensive audit of Sentinel's trading operations and financial controls. What I've found represents both opportunities for improvement and areas of significant concern." He clicked to the first slide and started walking them through his findings. The legitimate ones. The safe ones. Issues with documentation procedures and authorization workflows. Cases where traders had exceeded their risk limits. Gaps in oversight that could expose the company to regulatory scrutiny. The executives listened with varying degrees of attention. Some took notes. Others checked their phones under the table. Garvin's expression never changed. Marcus finished the presentation in 40 minutes and opened the floor for questions. "These findings," one executive said, "do they suggest systematic issues or isolated incidents?" "Isolated incidents with common root causes," Marcus replied. "Inadequate training and unclear accountability structures. Nothing that can't be addressed through policy reforms and better oversight." "And the Chen situation?" another asked. "Appears to have been an outlier. I found no evidence of similar activity in other departments." It was a lie. Marcus had found evidence of similar activity in at least 6 other departments. But that wasn't going into this report. That was being saved for later. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, and Marcus answered each one with calm professionalism. He was good at this. He'd always been good at this. Making complex problems sound manageable. Making nervous executives feel like everything was under control. Finally, Garvin spoke for the first time. "What's your timeline for the final report?" he asked. Marcus met his eyes. 6 weeks. I want to complete a few more verification procedures before submitting final recommendations. Acceptable, Garvin said. Then, to Pierce, make sure he has whatever access he needs. Pierce nodded, and the meeting was over. Executives filed out, some thanking Marcus as they passed, others ignoring him entirely. Marcus packed up his laptop and was heading for the door when Pierce stopped him. "That went well," Pierce said. "The board's satisfied. Keep doing what you're doing." "I will." Marcus rode the elevator back down to 37 and returned to his small office. He closed the door, sat down at his desk, and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 2 months. He'd just presented findings to the people who'd destroyed him, and they had no idea who he was. Richard Garvin had looked directly at him and seen nothing. Marcus opened his laptop and pulled up the hidden files. The real evidence. The archive that proved everything. 6 more weeks, he'd told them. 6 weeks to finish building the case. 6 weeks to make sure every detail was perfect. And then he'd show them exactly who Marcus Hale was. And they'd never forget again. The 6 weeks turned into a chess game played in slow motion. Marcus would arrive at Sentinel each morning at 8, spend his days reviewing files and conducting interviews with employees who had no idea they were helping him build a case against their own company, then return home to Emma and pretend everything was normal. At night, after she fell asleep, he'd lock himself in the second bedroom and work on the real investigation until his eyes burned and coffee stopped helping. He was running on maybe 4 hours of sleep when his phone rang at 2 in the morning on a Thursday. Marcus jolted awake at his desk, nearly knocking over a cold cup of coffee, and grabbed the phone without checking the caller ID. "Yeah? Marcus Hale?" The voice was unfamiliar. Male, younger, nervous. Marcus sat up straighter, suddenly alert. "Who is this?" "My name's Kevin Torres. I work in compliance at Sentinel. I need to talk to you." "It's 2 a.m. "I know. I'm sorry, but I couldn't risk calling during the day." Torres paused, and Marcus could hear traffic in the background. "I found something big, and I think you're the only person who might actually care." Marcus rubbed his face, trying to force his brain into focus. "What did you find?" "Not over the phone. Can we meet?" Every instinct Marcus had screamed that this was a trap. Too convenient, too perfectly timed. But there was something in Torres's voice, genuine fear maybe, that made him hesitate. "Tomorrow," Marcus said. "There's a diner on 7th and Morrison. 6 p.m. "I'll be there." Torres hung up before Marcus could ask anything else. Marcus sat in the dark office, staring at his phone, trying to figure out if he'd just made a terrible mistake. He pulled up Sentinel's employee database and searched for Kevin Torres. Mid-20s, been with the company for 18 months, working in regulatory compliance. No disciplinary record. Performance reviews were solid, but not exceptional. Nothing that screamed insider threat or company plant. But that didn't mean much. If someone at Sentinel suspected what Marcus was really doing, they'd send someone convincing. Marcus spent the rest of the night pulling together everything he could find on Torres. Social media accounts showed a guy who posted about basketball and complained about his commute. Nothing political. Nothing that suggested hidden agendas. College transcripts showed decent grades from a state school. Work history before Sentinel included a brief stint at a smaller investment firm that had folded during the last recession. By the time the sun came up, Marcus still couldn't tell if Torres was legitimate or a threat. He got Emma ready for school on autopilot, his mind elsewhere. She noticed, she always noticed, and asked if he was okay. Marcus told her he was just tired from work, which was true enough that it didn't feel like lying. The day at Sentinel dragged. Marcus went through the motions of his audit, filed some paperwork, attended a meeting about revised compliance procedures that seemed designed to bore everyone into submission. All the while, he kept thinking about Torres, about what information could be big enough to make someone risk calling at 2 in the morning. At 5:30, Marcus left the office and drove to the diner. It was the kind of place that had been there for 40 years and looked like it. with cracked vinyl booths and a menu that probably hadn't changed since 1985. He ordered coffee and sat where he could see both the door and the street outside. Torres arrived at 6:07, glancing around nervously before spotting Marcus and sliding into the booth across from him. He was younger than his employee photo suggested, with dark circles under his eyes and hands that wouldn't stay still. "Thanks for meeting me," Torres said. "What's this about?" Torres pulled out his phone, checked it, then put it face down on the table. "I work in compliance review. Part of my job is monitoring trade execution patterns for irregularities. Standard stuff, making sure everything matches approved strategies, flagging outliers for investigation." "Okay. 3 weeks ago, I found a pattern. Trades executing through a subsidiary account that shouldn't have had authorization for the strategies being used. Small volumes, nothing that would trigger automatic alerts, but consistent. I flagged it for my supervisor." Marcus kept his expression neutral. "And? He told me to drop it, said the account had special clearance from the executive level, and it wasn't my concern." Torres's jaw tightened. "That didn't sit right. Special clearance isn't supposed to exempt anyone from compliance monitoring. So I kept digging, off the clock, using my own laptop." "That was stupid," Marcus said. "Yeah, I'm starting to realize that." Torres leaned forward. "The account traces back to a shell company in the Caymans, and that company has connections to 3 board members, including Richard Garvin." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You have proof?" "I have transaction records and corporate filings. I don't have direct evidence linking Garvin to the shell company, but the pattern's there if you know where to look." Torres pushed a flash drive across the table. "It's all on here, everything I found." Marcus stared at the drive, but didn't touch it. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because you're the only person investigating anything at Sentinel who isn't already on their payroll. I heard about your audit, people talk, and I did some research on you." Torres met his eyes. "I know what happened 5 years ago. I know they destroyed you, so I figure maybe you're the one person who won't bury this to protect them." "That's a lot of assumptions." "You got better options?" Torres asked. "Because I don't. If I take this to the SEC, it disappears into a bureaucracy that takes years to do anything, and by then I'm fired and blacklisted. If I take it to my supervisor again, I'm fired immediately. You're the only play I've got." Marcus studied Torres for a long moment, trying to read him. The fear seemed genuine. The desperation definitely was, but that didn't mean this wasn't a setup. "If this is a test," Marcus said slowly, "if someone sent you to see if I'd take bait, you can tell them I'm not interested. I'm here to do an audit, file a report, and get paid. That's it." Torres shook his head. "Nobody sent me. I'm just a guy who's in over his head and hoping you're actually who I think you are." "And who do you think I am?" "Someone who gives a damn about the truth." Marcus picked up the flash drive and slipped it into his pocket. "I'll look at what you've got. But if this blows back on you, I can't protect you. Understand?" "I understand." Torres stood up, leaving a $10 bill on the table for the coffee he hadn't ordered. "Watch your back, Hale. If I found this, other people might be looking too." He left through the front door and disappeared into the evening crowd. Marcus sat there for another 10 minutes, drinking cold coffee and trying to decide if he'd just gained an asset or walked into a trap. Finally, he paid and drove home, the flash drive feeling like it weighed 10 pounds in his pocket. Emma was at a friend's house for a sleepover, one of the small luxuries Marcus could afford now that he was making real money, which meant he had the apartment to himself. He locked both doors, closed all the blinds, and plugged the flash drive into his most secure laptop, the one that wasn't connected to any network and never would be. Torres hadn't been exaggerating. The files contained transaction records going back 3 years, showing a pattern of trades that should have been illegal if they weren't being executed through accounts with special clearances that bypassed normal oversight. The shell company in the Caymans was registered to a law firm that specialized in corporate privacy, which was a polite way of saying money laundering. And while there was no direct evidence linking Garvin to the company, the timeline of transactions lined up perfectly with internal Sentinel decisions that would have required executive approval. It was good work, thorough. The kind of investigation that would make Marcus's job significantly easier if the information was legitimate. The question was whether it was too good, too convenient that someone would just hand him exactly the kind of evidence he needed right when he needed it. Marcus spent 3 hours verifying what he could. He cross-referenced transaction dates with his own research, checked corporate registration details against public records, Traced the account authorizations through Sentinel's internal systems. Everything checked out. Nothing screamed fabrication. Either Torres was the real deal, or someone at Sentinel was running an incredibly sophisticated operation to test Marcus's loyalty. By midnight, Marcus had made a decision. He'd use Torres's information, but carefully. Verify everything independently before relying on it. And if it turned out to be a setup, he'd have enough plausible deniability to claim he'd been conducting due diligence rather than acting on suspicious intel. He encrypted Torres's files and added them to his growing archive, then went to bed with his phone next to the pillow in case anything else decided to explode at 2 a.m. Nothing did, but Marcus still didn't sleep well. The next morning, Pierce called during Marcus's commute. "We need to talk. Can you come by my office this afternoon?" "What's this about?" "Just come by. 2 o'clock. Pierce's office was in a different building, a glass tower in the financial district that made Sentinel's headquarters look modest by comparison. The receptionist directed Marcus to the 32nd floor, where Pierce's corner office had views that probably cost more per square foot than Marcus's entire apartment. Pierce was on the phone when Marcus arrived, gesturing for him to sit while finishing a conversation that seemed to involve yelling at someone about quarterly projections. When he finally hung up, he looked at Marcus with an expression that was hard to read. "The board's getting impatient," Pierce said without preamble. "They want your final report in 3 weeks, not 6. Marcus felt his carefully constructed timeline collapse. "That's not enough time to complete a thorough investigation." "I'm aware, but some people are nervous about what you might find, and they want this wrapped up before the next shareholders' meeting." Pierce leaned back in his chair. "Between you and me, I think someone's worried you're getting too close to something they'd prefer stayed buried." "Who? If I knew that, I wouldn't be having this conversation." Pierce studied him. "You need to make a choice, Hale. You can file a safe report that covers the basics and keeps everyone happy, collect your fee, and walk away. Or you can keep digging and see where it leads, knowing that if you find the wrong thing, they'll bury you again." "Sounds like you're telling me to back off." "I'm telling you to be smart," Pierce said. "These people don't forgive threats to their power. You already learned that once." Marcus stood up. "I'll have the report ready in 3 weeks." "That's not an answer to my question." "It's the only answer you're getting." Pierce watched him for a moment, then nodded. "Your funeral, but don't say I didn't warn you." Marcus left the office and rode the elevator down in silence, his mind racing. 3 weeks. That cut his timeline in half. He'd need to accelerate everything: the documentation, the verification, the preparation for what came after he submitted his findings. And Pierce's warning suggested someone inside Sentinel was getting nervous, which meant they might be watching him more closely than he'd realized. Marcus spent the weekend working almost non-stop. Emma complained that he was being boring, and she wasn't wrong. He tried to make it up to her with a trip to the park on Sunday afternoon, pushing her on the swings while his phone buzzed with alerts he couldn't check without being rude. She told him about school and her friends, and a book she was reading about a girl who found a magic door in her basement. "Do you think magic doors are real?" Emma asked from the swing, her hair flying as she pumped her legs. "I think sometimes opportunities show up that feel like magic," Marcus said, "but usually they're just chances you have to be ready to take." "That's not the same thing." "No, it's not. But it's better than magic." "Why?" "Because magic happens to you. Opportunities are things you make happen." Emma thought about this while swinging higher. "Are you making something happen, Dad?" Marcus caught the swing on its backswing and slowed it down so he could see her face. "Yeah, I am." "Is it good?" "I think so. But it's complicated." "Most good things are," Emma said, which was such an adult observation that Marcus had to hide his smile. They stayed at the park until the sun started setting and the other families packed up their kids. On the drive home, Emma fell asleep in the back seat, and Marcus carried her up to the apartment and tucked her into the air mattress without waking her. Then he locked himself in the office and got back to work. Monday morning, Marcus arrived at Sentinel to find his office door propped open and someone inside. He stopped in the hallway, every instinct screaming, but it was just building maintenance replacing a light fixture. "Sorry," the maintenance guy said, climbing down from a ladder. "Your bulb was out. Should be good now." "Thanks." The guy left, and Marcus sat down at his desk, staring at the new light fixture. Maybe it was legitimate maintenance, or maybe someone had been in his office installing something that wasn't a light bulb. Marcus pulled out his phone and ran a scanner app he'd installed for exactly this kind of situation. It took 3 minutes to sweep the room. No hidden cameras, no listening devices that the app could detect. Either the office was clean or whoever was watching him was using equipment too sophisticated for commercial scanner apps. He decided to assume he was being watched and acted accordingly. Spent the day conducting legitimate audit work, filing reports, scheduling interviews. Nothing that would raise suspicions. But during lunch, he left the building and walked 3 blocks to a coffee shop with free Wi-Fi. Used a burner laptop to access encrypted files stored in a cloud server registered to a fake identity. Worked for 40 minutes documenting new findings, then wiped the laptop's memory and returned to Sentinel like nothing had happened. It became a routine. Official work in the office where anyone could be watching. Real work done in coffee shops and libraries, and once in his car parked behind a grocery store because he'd run out of other options. The paranoia was exhausting, but it kept him alive. 2 weeks before his deadline, Marcus got a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Hale speaking. Mr. Hale, my name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm an investigative reporter with the Financial Chronicle. I'd like to talk to you about Sentinel Capital. Marcus felt his blood turn cold. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. I've been investigating Sentinel for 6 months. Corruption, fraud, systematic abuse of employees who ask too many questions, and I know you're conducting an audit there right now. Walsh paused. I also know what they did to you 5 years ago. This conversation is over. Wait, please. There was urgency in her voice now. I'm not trying to burn you. I'm trying to help. If you found evidence of criminal activity, I can make sure it gets out. I have sources in federal law enforcement. I have a platform that reaches millions of people. You file an internal report, they bury it. You go to the SEC alone, they bury you. But if you work with me, no, Marcus said, I'm not interested. They're going to destroy you again. You know that, right? The moment you become inconvenient, they'll... Marcus hung up. His hands were shaking. He sat in his car in the Sentinel parking garage and tried to figure out how a reporter had connected him to the audit. The work was supposed to be confidential. Only the board and Pierce's oversight committee knew about it, which meant either there was a leak or Walsh had sources inside Sentinel. Either way, it was a problem. Marcus drove home and spent the evening turning the situation over in his mind. Walsh could be legitimate. Plenty of reporters investigated corporate corruption. But she could also be a plant, someone Sentinel sent to see if Marcus would leak confidential information. He decided to ignore her, stay focused on his own timeline. But he also started being even more careful about what he documented and where he stored it. The paranoia was getting worse, which probably meant he was getting close to something that mattered. With 1 week left before his deadline, Marcus worked 18-hour days. Emma barely saw him. He'd leave before she woke up and come home after she was asleep. She left him notes on the kitchen table, drawings, questions about when they'd hang out again, one that just said, I miss you, with a heart drawn underneath. Each note felt like a knife in his chest, but he couldn't slow down now. Not when he was this close. 5 days before the deadline, Marcus found the final piece. He was reviewing executive compensation records, dry, boring work that most auditors would skim, when he noticed an anomaly in Richard Garvin's stock options. The timing didn't match the board's official approval dates. Someone had backdated the paperwork to make it look like Garvin had exercised options at favorable prices, which was securities fraud at a level that would make the SEC salivate. And the pattern repeated across 4 other executives, all of them people who'd been involved in framing Marcus 5 years ago. Marcus documented everything with hands that shook from exhaustion and too much coffee. This was it. The evidence that would destroy them completely. Stock fraud, systematic theft, conspiracy to commit securities violations. Combined with everything else he'd found, the insider trading, the shell companies, the falsified records, it painted a picture of an organization that was fundamentally criminal. He copied the files to his secure drives, triple-checked the encryption, and allowed himself to believe for just a moment that he was actually going to pull this off. That night, he came home at a reasonable hour for the first time in weeks. Emma was still awake, reading in bed with a flashlight, even though the overhead light worked fine. You're home early, she said, surprised. I know. I'm sorry I've been gone so much. Emma set down her book. Is your work almost done? Almost? 1 more week. And then things go back to normal? Marcus sat on the edge of her air mattress. I don't think things are going to be normal for a while. But they'll be better. I promise. You keep promising things are going to be better. I know. Are you sure this time? Marcus looked at his daughter, this 7-year-old who'd learned to doubt promises because life had taught her that adults couldn't always keep them, and made a decision. Come here, he said. Emma scooted over and Marcus pulled her into a hug. She wrapped her small arms around him and squeezed tight. I'm going to tell you something I probably shouldn't, Marcus said quietly. But I need you to understand. The work I'm doing right now, it's not just a job. It's fixing something that's been broken for a long time, something that hurt us. And when I'm done, people are going to know the truth about what happened. Emma pulled back to look at his face. About the bad stuff from before? Yeah. Are you going to get in trouble? Maybe, probably, but it'll be worth it. Emma considered this with a seriousness that made her seem much older than 7. Will we have to move again? I don't know. We might. Okay. She hugged him again. As long as we're together. Marcus felt something break loose in his chest. Yeah, as long as we're together. He stayed with her until she fell asleep, then went to the locked room and worked until dawn, fueled by the promise he'd just made and the knowledge that he only had a few days left to make it count. The final report took 3 days to write. Marcus crafted it carefully, walking a line between what he could prove and what would get him killed. The official version, the one he'd submit to Pierce and the board, documented policy violations and recommended structural reforms. Professional, thorough. Exactly what they'd hired him to do. But buried in the appendices, hidden in technical language and cross-references that most people would skip over, Marcus included enough breadcrumbs to lead any competent investigator to the real evidence. The offshore accounts, the backdated stock options, the pattern of fraudulent trades, and separately in encrypted files that wouldn't be part of his official submission, Marcus prepared the full case. Every document, every piece of evidence, everything he'd found over the past 4 months, organized and annotated and ready to hand to prosecutors. He just needed to figure out how to get it to them without getting buried in the process. On the morning his report was due, Marcus woke up at 5 a.m. with his heart pounding and the certainty that today was going to change everything. He got Emma ready for school, made her breakfast, helped her pack her backpack, tried to memorize the mundane details because he didn't know when he'd get to do this again. Big day? Emma asked, noticing his mood. Yeah, big day. Good luck, Dad. Thanks, kiddo. He dropped her at school, then drove to Sentinel for what he suspected might be the last time. The final report was on a flash drive in his pocket. The real evidence was stored in multiple locations, backed up and encrypted and ready to deploy. Marcus rode the elevator to the 37th floor, walked to his small office, and sat down at the desk where he'd spent 4 months pretending to be someone he wasn't. Then he sent an email to Pierce. Final report complete, ready to present whenever convenient. Pierce's response came back in under a minute. Conference room 47A, 1 hour. Marcus spent the next 60 minutes reviewing his presentation one last time, making sure every word was exactly right. This was the performance that would determine whether he lived or died, whether Emma had a father or became an orphan. No pressure. At 10:58, Marcus gathered his materials and headed for the elevator. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. 5 years of planning and patience had led to this moment, and he was ready. The 47th floor was exactly as he remembered from his last visit. Same thick carpet, same expensive artwork, same sense of power concentrated in a few thousand square feet of real estate. The conference room was full. Not just the board members from last time, but additional executives Marcus recognized from his research. And seated at the head of the table, watching him enter with cold eyes, was Richard Garvin. Marcus set up his laptop and looked around the room at the people who'd destroyed him and smiled. Thank you all for coming, he said. Let's begin. The presentation screen flickered to life behind Marcus, displaying the Sentinel Capital logo and the title, Comprehensive Audit, Final Findings and Recommendations. He clicked to the first slide, a summary of his methodology, and began speaking in the same calm, professional tone he'd used in the preliminary presentation. Over the past 4 months, I've conducted a thorough review of Sentinel's trading operations, financial controls, and compliance procedures. My investigation covered approximately 43,000 individual transactions, reviewed communications from 17 departments, and interviewed 62 employees across all levels of the organization. The executives settled into their chairs, some pulling out tablets to take notes, others looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Garvin's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes never left Marcus. Marcus advanced through the slides methodically. Policy violations in the trading department, inadequate documentation and compliance, authorization workflows that created unnecessary delays and opportunities for human error, standard corporate problems that every company this size dealt with, nothing that would cause panic. 15 minutes in, one of the board members, a woman named Patricia Chen, who Marcus recognized as the audit committee chair, interrupted. "These findings seem consistent with your preliminary report," she said. "Is there anything significantly new?" Marcus paused, letting the question hang in the air for a moment. "There are some additional areas of concern that warrant deeper discussion. I've documented them in the appendices, but I thought it would be more appropriate to cover the broader recommendations first." "We can handle the details," Garvin said, speaking for the first time. His voice was smooth, controlled. "Why don't you skip to these areas of concern?" Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. "Of course, if you'll turn to page 47 of the report." He watched as executives pulled up the document on their tablets, flipping through pages of dense technical analysis. Marcus had structured this section carefully, buried the most damaging findings in language that would seem innocuous to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but would light up like a flare to anyone who knew what they were seeing. "I identified several instances of trading activity executed through subsidiary accounts that appear to lack proper authorization documentation," Marcus said. "The volumes are relatively small, but the pattern suggests either a gap in our compliance oversight or potentially unauthorized trading strategies." "Which accounts?" asked a CFO named Michael Brennan, leaning forward. Marcus displayed a list of account numbers. He watched faces around the table, looking for reactions. Most showed nothing. But 3 executives, including Daniel Chen's replacement, a guy named Robert Foster, exchanged quick glances that lasted maybe half a second. They knew. They knew exactly which accounts those were. "I've traced the authorization trail for these accounts," Marcus continued, and found that they were approved through executive override rather than standard compliance review. That's not necessarily improper, but it does circumvent the controls we have in place to prevent unauthorized risk exposure. "Who authorized the overrides?" Patricia Chen asked. Marcus pulled up another slide. Names appeared on the screen. 4 executives, all of them in the room. All of them watching him with expressions that had shifted from bored to very, very attentive. "The authorization signatures appear legitimate," Marcus said carefully. "However, I was unable to locate the supporting documentation that would normally accompany executive overrides of this nature. It's possible the documentation exists, and I simply didn't have access to the right systems. Or it's possible the overrides were granted without proper paperwork." The room had gone quiet. Marcus could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm. Garvin leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "And what do you recommend?" "Additional investigation by someone with full executive-level access," Marcus said. "I've documented the accounts and transaction patterns. Someone from internal audit should be able to determine whether this represents a compliance gap or something more serious." It was the safe answer, the smart answer. Exactly what they'd expect from a consultant who wanted to keep his head down and collect his fee. But Marcus wasn't done. "However," he continued, "there is one additional matter that I believe requires immediate attention." He clicked to a new slide. The room seemed to freeze. On the screen was a breakdown of stock option exercises by senior executives over the past 5 years. At first glance, it looked like standard compensation data, but Marcus had highlighted specific dates in red, and those dates told a story. "During my review, I noticed inconsistencies in the timing of executive stock option exercises," Marcus said, his voice still calm but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "Specifically, several exercises appear to have been backdated to coincide with favorable market conditions." "That's a serious accusation," Brennan said, his voice tight. "It's an observation based on the documentation I reviewed," Marcus corrected. "The approval dates on the paperwork don't match the board meeting minutes where these options were supposedly authorized. The discrepancy is usually between 2 and 4 weeks." Patricia Chen was scrolling through her tablet rapidly now, checking the data. "This could be explained by administrative delays in processing the paperwork." "It could be," Marcus agreed. "Except the backdating consistently benefits the executives in question. Every single instance resulted in a more favorable exercise price than if the options had been exercised on the actual approval date. The probability of that happening by chance is statistically negligible. Garvin stood up abruptly. I think we need to take a break. I'm not finished with my presentation, Marcus said. Nevertheless, Garvin's voice had gone cold. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. Mr. Hale, please wait outside. It wasn't a request. Marcus saved his presentation, closed his laptop, and walked out of the conference room. The door shut behind him with a solid click, and he could hear raised voices immediately starting on the other side. He stood in the hallway, alone except for a receptionist who carefully avoided making eye contact, and waited. 23 minutes later, the door opened and Jonathan Pierce stepped out. His expression was carefully neutral, but Marcus could see tension in his jaw. Walk with me, Pierce said. They went to an empty office down the hall, and Pierce closed the door before speaking. What the hell are you doing? Pierce asked quietly. Presenting my findings. You know what I mean. The stock options. That wasn't in your preliminary report. You blindsided them. Marcus met his eyes. I found the evidence after filing the preliminary findings. Did you want me to ignore it? I wanted you to be smart. Pierce ran a hand through his hair. Do you have any idea what you've just done? That's not some mid-level manager stealing petty cash. Those are board-level executives you're accusing of securities fraud. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm presenting data and letting the board decide what to do with it. Don't play semantic games with me, Hale. You know exactly what you're doing. Pierce studied him for a long moment. The question is why? What do you gain from making enemies of the most powerful people at this company? Marcus considered lying, but decided there wasn't much point anymore. I gained the truth. That's all I've ever wanted. The truth gets people killed in situations like this. Then I guess we'll find out how committed to transparency the board really is. Pierce laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. I haven't decided which yet. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I told them to hire you because I thought you'd do good work. I didn't think you'd commit professional suicide in a conference room. Maybe I'm not the one committing suicide, Marcus said. Pierce left without responding. Marcus stood alone in the empty office and felt the weight of what he'd just set in motion. There was no going back now. He'd fired the first shot, and the only question was how they'd respond. The answer came faster than he expected. 10 minutes later, his phone rang, Garvin's assistant, asking him to come to the CEO's office immediately. Marcus took the elevator up one more floor to the executive suite he'd only seen once before, 5 years ago, when Garvin had called him in to personally deliver the news that he was being terminated pending investigation. The office looked the same, floor-to-ceiling windows, furniture that cost more than most people's cars, art on the walls that probably belonged in a museum. Garvin stood by the window, looking out at the city below. He didn't turn around when Marcus entered. Close the door, Garvin said. Marcus did. Do you know what the most valuable thing in this business is? Garvin asked, still facing the window. It's not money. Money comes and goes. Markets rise and fall. The most valuable thing is control. The ability to shape outcomes, to determine who succeeds and who fails. I'm aware, Marcus said. Garvin turned around, and for the first time, Marcus saw something in his expression that looked almost like respect. You're smarter than I gave you credit for. Most people in your position would have taken their fee and walked away. But you didn't. You pushed. Which means you're either working an angle I don't see, or you have a death wish. Maybe I just care about doing the job I was hired to do. Nobody cares that much about a job. Garvin moved to his desk and sat down. So let's skip the performance and talk like adults. What do you want? Marcus stayed standing. I want you to address the findings in my report. The backdated options, among other things. Garvin smiled, and it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. You're presenting this as a compliance issue, an audit finding that needs investigation, but we both know what you're really saying. You're saying that I personally engaged in securities fraud, that I enriched myself illegally, that I'm a criminal. I presented data. The conclusions are yours. Stop it. Garvin's voice hardened. Stop pretending you're just a neutral auditor doing his job. You came here for a reason, and I think I figured out what it is. Marcus said nothing. You're Marcus Hale, Garvin continued, leaning forward. The engineer we terminated 5 years ago for insider trading. You think I don't remember? You think I didn't recognize you the moment you walked into that boardroom the first time? The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Garvin had known. From the beginning, he'd known exactly who Marcus was. I remember you, Garvin said quietly. Smart kid. Built systems that made this company billions. And then you started asking questions about things that weren't your concern, started poking into accounts you shouldn't have been looking at. You became a problem, so we solved you. You framed me. We protected the company. There's a difference. Garvin stood and walked around the desk. And now you've spent 5 years planning whatever this is. Coming back under a different name, getting hired through Pierce's committee, conducting your little investigation. Very clever, very patient, but ultimately pointless. You're admitting to destroying my career based on false charges, Marcus said, keeping his voice level. That's conspiracy to commit fraud. That's criminal. Garvin laughed. You think you're recording this? You think you're going to walk out of here with evidence? He gestured around the office. This room is swept daily. No recording devices, no witnesses. Nothing you say here can ever be proven. And if you try to claim I admitted anything, it's your word against mine. We both know how that ends. Marcus felt ice spread through his veins. Garvin was right. Nothing said in this room would ever be admissible evidence. So here's what's going to happen, Garvin continued. You're going to revise your report, remove the sections about the stock options. Remove any implications of impropriety. You'll file a clean audit that shows we have minor compliance issues that we're already addressing. And in exchange, you'll receive your full fee plus a bonus. Say, another $50,000. Call it compensation for your thoroughness. And if I refuse, then you'll face the consequences of making false accusations against members of this company's leadership. We'll sue you for defamation, breach of contract. We'll tie you up in litigation for the next decade. We'll make sure you never work in finance again. We'll make sure your daughter, Emma, isn't it, grows up knowing her father is a bitter, delusional man who destroyed his own life chasing conspiracy theories. The mention of Emma made Marcus's hands clench into fists. You're threatening my daughter? I'm stating facts. Actions have consequences, Mr. Hale. You of all people should understand that by now. Marcus stood there, every muscle in his body screaming to do something, anything, to wipe that smile off Garvin's face. But he forced himself to breathe, to think. This was the moment Garvin expected him to break, to either accept the bribe or lash out in anger and give them grounds to have him removed from the building. Marcus did neither. I need time to consider your offer, he said carefully. Garvin studied him. You have until tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Come back with your decision. He returned to his desk, dismissing Marcus with a gesture. And Mr. Hale? Choose wisely. You won't get another chance. Marcus left the office and rode the elevator down in a daze. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up with him. Garvin had known from the beginning, had let Marcus conduct his investigation, probably amused by the idea of the man he'd destroyed thinking he could somehow strike back. Which meant Garvin had underestimated him, had assumed Marcus would fold when confronted with the choice between money and truth. That was his mistake. Marcus drove straight to Emma's school and picked her up early, claiming a doctor's appointment. She knew something was wrong. He could see it in the way she watched him, the questions she didn't ask, but she didn't push. They went to the park, and Marcus pushed her on the swings while his mind raced through scenarios and options. Dad, you're being weird, Emma finally said from the swing. I know, I'm sorry. Did something bad happen at work? Marcus caught the swing and slowed it down so he could see her face. Something complicated happened. I need to make a decision about what to do next, and I'm not sure what the right choice is. Emma considered this with her characteristic seriousness. Mom used to say that the right choice is the one you can live with after you make it. Your mom said that? Yeah, when she was deciding whether to move to Seattle. Emma looked down at her hands. She said she had to choose between what was easy and what was right for her, and she picked what was right for her, even though it meant leaving us. Marcus felt something crack in his chest. I'm sorry she left. I'm not asking you to be sorry. I'm just saying that's what she told me. You have to pick what you can live with. Marcus pulled Emma off the swing and hugged her tight. She was 7 years old and already wiser than most adults he knew. That night, after Emma was asleep, Marcus sat in the locked room and made his final preparations. He'd known this moment was coming. had planned for it through every step of the past 4 months. Now it was time to execute. He opened an encrypted email account he'd set up months ago and started composing messages. The first went to Jennifer Walsh, the reporter who'd called him weeks earlier. He attached a compressed file containing every piece of evidence he'd gathered: the backdated stock options, the offshore accounts, the falsified trading records, the memo detailing how they'd framed him 5 years ago. Everything. The email was set to send automatically in 72 hours unless Marcus logged in to cancel it. A dead man's switch, insurance in case something happened to him. The second email went to a lawyer he'd researched but never contacted, someone with a reputation for taking on powerful corporations and winning. He outlined his situation and included enough evidence to make it clear this wasn't a frivolous case. That email was also set to delay send. The third email went to the SEC's whistleblower division. Full documentation, full disclosure, everything they'd need to open an investigation. Also delayed 72 hours. Then Marcus pulled up the file containing his revised audit report, the one Garvin wanted him to submit. He stared at it for a long time, this document that represented the easy path. The safe path. Take the money, protect his daughter, disappear again. He could live with that choice. He'd lived with worse, but Emma's words echoed in his head. The right choice is the one you can live with after you make it. Marcus deleted the revised report and started writing something else. The full truth. Every finding, every piece of evidence, every conclusion he'd reached over 4 months of investigation. An audit report that would destroy Sentinel Capital completely. He worked through the night, fueled by coffee and the certainty that he was burning every bridge he had left. By the time the sun came up, the report was done. 63 pages of detailed analysis and damning evidence, formatted professionally and backed by documentation that would hold up to scrutiny. Marcus encrypted the file, saved it to multiple locations, and attached it to an email addressed to the board's audit committee with Pierce and Garvin copied. Then he sat back and stared at the send button. This was it. The point of no return. Once he sent this, there was no taking it back. Garvin would make good on his threats. The lawsuits would come. The attempts to destroy him would be systematic and brutal, but they'd also be public. And publicity was the one thing Garvin couldn't control completely. Marcus thought about Emma sleeping in the next room, about the life he wanted to give her, about the man he wanted to be when she looked at him. He clicked send. The email disappeared into the void, and Marcus felt something that might have been fear or might have been relief. Probably both. He checked the delayed emails, all queued and ready to send in 72 hours unless he canceled them. Multiple fail-safes, multiple ways for the truth to get out even if Garvin tried to silence him. Then Marcus made breakfast for Emma like it was any other morning. She came stumbling out of her room at 7:30, hair sticking up in different directions, and sat at the table while he poured her cereal. "You look tired," she said. "I didn't sleep much." "Did you make your decision?" Marcus set the cereal box down and sat across from her. "Yeah, I did." "What did you decide?" "I decided to do the right thing, even though it's going to make some people very angry." Emma absorbed this while chewing her cereal. "Are we going to be okay?" "I don't know," Marcus said honestly. "Things are going to get complicated for a while, but we'll figure it out together." "Promise?" "Promise." He dropped Emma at school at 8:15, then drove to Sentinel one last time. The parking garage felt different now, ominous in a way it hadn't before. Marcus rode the elevator to the 37th floor and packed up his small office, the few personal items he'd brought, his notebooks, the files he was authorized to keep. At 8:57, his phone rang. "Pierce." "Tell me you didn't do what I think you did," Pierce said without preamble. "I submitted my final report. The real one. The full report." Pierce sounded somewhere between furious and impressed. "Do you have any idea what you've just started?" "Yeah, I do. Garvin's on a rampage. He's already got legal mobilizing. You're going to be sued into oblivion, Hale. They're going to destroy you." "They already destroyed me once. What's one more time? This is different. This is you attacking them directly. They won't just discredit you, they'll obliterate you." Pierce paused. "And for what? You think the board's going to do anything with your report? You think they're going to turn on Garvin based on the accusations of a consultant they barely know?" "Maybe not," Marcus admitted, "but the report's out there now. And I made sure it won't be the only copy that exists." There was a long silence on the other end. What did you do? I took out insurance. If anything happens to me, if I get buried in lawsuits or have an unfortunate accident, the evidence goes to multiple media outlets, federal investigators, and every regulatory agency that might care. You're blackmailing them. I'm protecting myself. There's a difference. Pierce laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. You've got bigger balls than I thought, Hale. Stupid, but impressive. Another pause. For what it's worth, I believe you. I think Garvin and his crew are exactly as corrupt as you say they are. But believing you and being able to help you are two different things. I've got my own career to protect. I know. I'm not asking you to do anything. Good. Because I can't. Pierce sighed. Watch your back. These people don't forgive and they don't forget. The line went dead. Marcus finished packing and left the office for the last time. He was halfway to the elevator when security stopped him. Mr. Hale, you need to come with us. There were 3 of them, professional and polite, but clearly not offering a choice. Marcus went with them to a conference room on the executive floor, where 2 lawyers he'd never met were waiting with paperwork spread across the table. Mr. Hale, I'm David Kessler, representing Sentinel Capital, the older lawyer said. Please sit down. Marcus sat. The lawyers remained standing. You submitted an audit report this morning containing serious and unsubstantiated allegations against multiple members of this company's leadership, Kessler continued. These allegations constitute defamation, breach of contract, and violation of the confidentiality agreement you signed when you accepted this engagement. The allegations are substantiated. I provided documentation for every claim. Documentation you obtained through unauthorized access to systems beyond the scope of your audit. The second lawyer, a woman named Reeves, slid a paper across the table. This is a cease and desist order. You are prohibited from discussing your findings with anyone outside this company. You are prohibited from accessing any Sentinel systems or data, and you are prohibited from making any public statements regarding your work here. Marcus read the document. It was exactly what he'd expected, legal threats designed to intimidate him into silence. And if I ignore this, then we'll see you in court, Kessler said. We'll sue you for damages in excess of $10 million. We'll freeze any assets you have. We'll make sure you spend the next decade fighting litigation you can't afford. You're welcome to try. Reeves leaned forward. Mr. Hale, I don't think you understand your position. You're a single individual going up against a corporation with unlimited legal resources. You can't win this fight. Maybe not, Marcus said, but I can make it expensive. I can make it public. And I can make sure that every piece of evidence I found ends up in the hands of people who'll actually do something with it. The lawyers exchanged glances. Is that a threat? Kessler asked. It's a statement of fact. I've taken precautions. If anything happens to me, if I get sued into bankruptcy, if I have an accident, if I mysteriously disappear, multiple copies of my findings get automatically distributed to federal regulators, media outlets, and law enforcement agencies. So you need to ask yourself whether destroying me is worth the exposure that comes with it. Marcus stood up. Now, if we're done here, I have a daughter to pick up from school. He walked out before they could respond, half expecting security to stop him again. But no one did. He made it to his car, drove out of the garage, and didn't breathe properly until he was 6 blocks away. His phone started ringing immediately. Unknown numbers, probably more lawyers or Garvin's people trying different approaches. Marcus ignored all of them. Instead, he called the one person he thought might actually help. Jennifer Walsh answered on the second ring. Mr. Hale, I was hoping I'd hear from you. We need to talk, Marcus said, but not over the phone. Can you meet me somewhere public? Give me a location. They met at a coffee shop in a busy shopping district, surrounded by enough people that no one could disappear him without witnesses. Walsh was younger than Marcus expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence in her eyes that suggested she didn't miss much. Thanks for meeting me, Marcus said. Are you kidding? You're the story I've been chasing for 6 months. Walsh pulled out a recorder. Do you mind? No recording, not yet. I need to know I can trust you first. Walsh put the recorder away. Fair enough, so talk. Marcus spent the next hour laying out everything. The evidence he'd found, the confrontation with Garvin, the dead man's switch emails set to send if anything happened to him. Walsh listened without interrupting, taking notes in shorthand. When he finished, she sat back and let out a low whistle. This is bigger than I thought, she said. If even half of what you're telling me is true, this is Enron-level corruption. It's all true. I have documentation for everything. I believe you, but believing you and being able to publish it are different things. I need to verify independently. I need sources beyond just you, and I need to make sure my editors don't kill the story because they're afraid of getting sued. How long will that take? Weeks, maybe months. Walsh studied him. Can you survive that long? Because from what you've described, Sentinel's going to come after you hard and fast. I've got insurance. They know if they push too hard, the evidence goes public immediately. That buys you time, but it doesn't make you safe. Walsh leaned forward. Here's what I can do. I'll start digging independently. Verify what you've given me. Build a case that doesn't rely solely on your testimony, and when I've got enough, I'll publish. But you need to stay alive and stay free until then. Can you do that? Marcus thought about Emma, about the promises he'd made, about how much harder it was to protect someone when the entire world was trying to destroy you. Yeah, he said, I can do that. Walsh gave him her personal number and made him promise to check in daily. If I don't hear from you for 48 hours, I'm publishing everything I have, incomplete or not. Understand? Understood. They parted ways, and Marcus drove to pick up Emma from school. She came running out with her backpack bouncing, smiling about something that had happened at recess. Marcus tried to match her energy, tried to pretend this was a normal day. But when they got home, there was an envelope taped to their apartment door. No stamp, no return address, just his name written in block letters. Marcus waited until Emma was in the bathroom to open it. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message typed in capital letters. You made your choice. Now live with the consequences. Marcus burned the note in the kitchen sink and flushed the ashes. Then he checked every window, every lock, made sure the doors were secure. Emma came out and found him standing by the window looking at the street below. Dad, you're scaring me. Marcus turned to her and forced a smile. Sorry, just being paranoid. Everything's fine. But everything wasn't fine, and they both knew it. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He sat in the locked room with the lights off, watching the monitors, waiting for whatever came next. It came at 3 a.m, not lawyers or threats, but something worse. His email inbox exploded with messages, hundreds of them. His phone started ringing with calls from numbers all across the country. And when Marcus pulled up a news site, he understood why. Someone had leaked his identity, his real name, his history with Sentinel, the accusations from 5 years ago. Every news outlet in the country was running the story. Disgraced former employee launches vendetta against Sentinel Capital. They'd spun it perfectly. Made him look like a bitter, delusional man seeking revenge. Made his audit look like a fabrication designed to hurt the company that had rightfully terminated him for fraud. And it was all over the internet, spreading faster than Marcus could track. Garvin had made his move, and it was devastating. Marcus sat in the dark, watching his life get destroyed in real time. The news articles kept multiplying. Business networks, financial blogs, even tabloid sites picking up the story. They all said the same thing in different words. Marcus Hale, the engineer fired for fraud 5 years ago, had wormed his way back into Sentinel Capital under false pretenses and was now making wild accusations to settle a personal vendetta. The comment sections were worse. People he'd never met calling him a liar, a fraud, a pathetic failure trying to blame others for his own mistakes. Someone had dug up photos from his arrest 5 years ago, and they were everywhere. Marcus being led out of Sentinel's building by federal agents, his face pale with shock, looking exactly like the criminal they'd claimed he was. His phone kept buzzing with calls and texts. Reporters wanting comments. Former colleagues asking if the stories were true. Blocked numbers that he suspected were Sentinel's legal team trying to reach him through different channels. Marcus ignored all of it and focused on the one thing that mattered. The dead man's switch emails were still queued. 70 hours left before they sent automatically. As long as those remained active, Garvin couldn't bury him completely without risking everything going public. But Marcus hadn't anticipated the media blitz, hadn't realized that Garvin would sacrifice his own privacy to destroy Marcus's credibility. By tomorrow morning, every person in the country with an internet connection would believe Marcus was exactly what Sentinel claimed, a bitter, delusional man who couldn't let go of his failures. When Emma woke up at 7, Marcus was still sitting in the locked room, surrounded by monitors showing his character assassination playing out across 100 different websites. She knocked on the door. "Dad, are you okay?" Marcus closed the browser windows and opened the door. Emma stood there in her pajamas, holding the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 3 and only brought out when she was scared. "I'm fine, kiddo." "No, you're not. Your picture's on TV." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "What?" Emma led him to the living room and pointed at the television, which she must have turned on while making herself cereal. The morning news was running the story with his photo displayed prominently next to Sentinel's logo. "Allegations that several sources describe as completely fabricated," the anchor was saying. Sentinel Capital released a statement calling Mr. Hale's accusations baseless and defamatory, noting his history of fraudulent activity within the company. Legal experts say this appears to be a case of a disgruntled former employee attempting to damage the reputation of his former employer. Marcus turned off the TV. Emma looked up at him with those sharp eyes that saw too much. "Is it true? What they're saying about you?" "No, it's not true." "Then why are they saying it?" Marcus sat down on the couch, and Emma climbed up next to him. "Because sometimes when you tell the truth about powerful people, they try to make everyone think you're lying. They're better at getting their story out than I am at telling mine. That's not fair." "No, it's not." Emma was quiet for a moment, chewing on her bottom lip the way she did when she was thinking hard about something. "Are we going to have to move again?" "I don't know. Maybe." "I don't want to move. I like my school. I like my friends." Marcus pulled her close. "I know. I'm sorry." She wrapped her arms around him and squeezed tight. "It's okay, Dad. As long as we're together." The words broke something in Marcus's chest. This 7-year-old shouldn't have to be the one reassuring him. Shouldn't have to deal with any of this. But she was, because Marcus had made choices that affected her life whether she understood them or not. He made her breakfast and got her ready for school, even though part of him wanted to keep her home, keep her safe. But Emma needed normal, needed routine, needed to believe the world wasn't completely falling apart even if it was. When he dropped her off, some of the other parents stared. A few whispered to each other. One mother Marcus had chatted with before picked up her pace and walked in a different direction when she saw him. Emma noticed. She always noticed. "I'll see you after school, okay?" Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Okay." Emma hugged him tight, then ran toward the building without looking back. Marcus sat in his car and watched her disappear into the school, then drove home with his phone exploding with new messages he wasn't going to read. When he got back to the apartment, Jennifer Walsh was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against a car that looked like it had seen better days. "We need to talk," she said. They went inside and Walsh didn't waste time. "Your story went viral overnight. Sentinel's PR machine is working overtime to bury you. Every major outlet is running their version." "I noticed, but here's the thing. They're moving too fast. Too aggressively. Companies don't launch this kind of coordinated media offensive unless they're genuinely scared." Walsh pulled out her laptop. "Which means there's truth to what you found. So I've been digging. Called in favors from other reporters. Reached out to former Sentinel employees who left under suspicious circumstances. And I found something." She turned the laptop to show Marcus a document. "This is from a whistleblower at the SEC. They've been quietly investigating Sentinel for 18 months. Nothing public, nothing official yet, but the investigation exists. And your audit report just landed on their desk this morning." Marcus felt something shift. How did they get it? Someone on the board's audit committee forwarded it. Anonymously, but the metadata is there if you know how to look. Walsh grinned. "You've got at least one ally inside Sentinel. Someone who wants the truth out as badly as you do." "Pierce," Marcus said quietly. The man had said he couldn't help, but maybe he'd found a way to help without putting his name on it. Whoever it was, it means the SEC can't ignore this. They've already got an open investigation. Your report gives them everything they need to escalate. Walsh closed her laptop. "But here's the problem. The SEC moves slow. Even with solid evidence, it'll take months before they bring charges. Maybe years. And in the meantime, Sentinel's going to keep destroying your reputation. So what do I do?" "You fight back. Publicly." Walsh leaned forward. "I've got editors who are willing to run your side of the story. Not everyone's convinced by Sentinel's spin. Some reporters smell blood in the water. If you're willing to go on record, full interview, documentation, everything, I can get your story out there. Marcus thought about Emma, about the promise he'd made to keep her safe. Going public meant making himself a bigger target. Meant confirming everything Sentinel was saying about him being a vengeful ex-employee with an axe to grind. But staying silent meant letting them win, meant spending the rest of his life as the villain in a story he hadn't written. What would I need to do? Marcus asked. Walsh outlined the plan. A full interview with supporting documentation, published simultaneously across 3 major outlets to maximize impact. Coordinated with the SEC filing so the timing reinforced the legitimacy of his claims. It won't be easy, Walsh warned. Sentinel will sue. They'll come after you harder than before, but it also means you're not fighting alone anymore. Once the story's out, they can't make you disappear quietly. Marcus spent the rest of the morning preparing. Walsh brought a video crew to the apartment. Small operation, just 2 people with cameras that looked professional enough to be credible. They set up in the living room while Marcus gathered every piece of documentation he could share without violating the parts of his NDA that might actually hold up in court. The interview took 3 hours. Walsh asked hard questions about his history with Sentinel, about the fraud charges, about his motivations for conducting the audit. Marcus answered all of them honestly, knowing that credibility was the only weapon he had left. Why should people believe you? Walsh asked at one point. Sentinel says you're a convicted fraudster with a grudge. I was never convicted, Marcus said. I signed a settlement to avoid prosecution for crimes I didn't commit because I couldn't afford to fight a company with unlimited resources. That's not the same thing as being guilty. But you can see how people might question your credibility. Sure, which is why I'm not asking anyone to just take my word for it. I've got documentation, transaction records, internal memos, communications between executives planning how to frame me 5 years ago. Everything I found is verifiable through public records and subpoenaed documents. The evidence speaks for itself. And if Sentinel sues you for this interview, Marcus met Walsh's eyes directly, then I'll see them in court, and I'll make sure every piece of evidence gets entered into the public record through discovery. They can sue me into bankruptcy if they want, but they can't stop the truth from coming out anymore. When the interview wrapped, Walsh's crew packed up their equipment while she reviewed footage on a laptop. This is good, Walsh said. Really good. My editors are going to love it. When does it publish? Tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. We're coordinating with the Times and the Post, so it drops everywhere simultaneously. She looked up at Marcus. After that, there's no taking it back. You ready for what comes next? Marcus thought about Emma at school, unaware that her father was about to become the center of a national scandal. Thought about the life he'd tried to build for them, fragile and imperfect, but theirs. Thought about the choice Claire had described, between what was easy and what you could live with. Yeah, he said, I'm ready. That evening, Marcus picked up Emma from school and took her out to dinner. Not the diner they usually went to, but a nicer place with actual tablecloths and menus that didn't have pictures. He could afford it now, and he wanted her to have something good before everything fell apart again. Emma ordered spaghetti and made a mess with the sauce, and Marcus didn't care. They talked about her day, the math test she'd aced, the argument she'd had with a friend at recess, the book they were reading in class about a kid who could talk to animals. Normal things. Beautiful things. The kind of moments Marcus had learned not to take for granted. After dinner, they walked to a park near the restaurant and sat on a bench watching the sun set. Emma leaned against his shoulder, comfortable in the silence. Dad? She said eventually. Yeah? Whatever happens, I'm proud of you. Marcus looked down at her, surprised. Why? Because you didn't give up. Even when things got really hard, you kept trying to make it better. She looked up at him with those serious eyes. That's what brave looks like, right? Not giving up even when you're scared? Marcus couldn't speak for a moment, emotion closing his throat. Finally, he managed, Yeah, kiddo, that's exactly what it looks like. They stayed at the park until the streetlights came on, then drove home. Marcus helped Emma with her homework and read her a chapter from her current book and tucked her into bed like it was any other night. Then he locked himself in the office and waited for the story to break. It happened at 6:02 a.m., 3 minutes after Walsh had promised. Marcus's phone started buzzing with alerts as the articles went live across multiple platforms simultaneously. He pulled them up on his monitors and watched his story spread across the internet. The Financial Chronicle led with Former engineer claims systematic fraud at Sentinel Capital, provides extensive documentation. The Times went with whistleblower report alleges securities violations by major investment firm. The Post framed it as new evidence reopens questions about 2020 fraud case. All three articles included portions of Marcus's interview. All three published excerpts from the audit report with names redacted where necessary. All three noted that the SEC had declined to comment but confirmed they were reviewing the matter. Within an hour, the story was trending nationally. By 8 a.m., cable news networks were running segments. By 9, Sentinel's stock price had dropped 12%. Marcus watched it unfold with a strange sense of detachment. This was what he'd been working toward for 5 years, but now that it was happening, he felt oddly calm. The die was cast. Whatever came next was out of his hands. His phone rang. Emma's school. "Mr. Hale? This is Principal Morrison. I need you to come pick up Emma immediately." Marcus's calm evaporated. "What happened? Is she hurt?" "She's fine physically, but there are reporters outside the school asking about her, and we can't have that kind of disruption. You need to come get her now." Marcus was in the car before the call ended. He drove to the school with his heart pounding, navigating around news vans parked on the street outside. A security guard escorted him inside to the principal's office, where Emma sat in a chair looking small and scared. "Dad!" She ran to him, and Marcus scooped her up, even though she was probably too big for it. Principal Morrison watched with an expression that was sympathetic but firm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hale, but given the circumstances, I think it's best if Emma stays home for a few days until this situation resolves itself." "You're suspending her?" "I'm protecting her. And the other students. We've had 3 reporters try to get onto school property this morning. I can't guarantee her safety with this level of media attention." Marcus wanted to argue but knew it wouldn't help. He thanked the principal and carried Emma out through a side door, avoiding the cameras at the front entrance. In the car, Emma was quiet until they were several blocks away. Then she said, "Are you famous now?" "Infamous, maybe." "What's the difference? Famous people are known for good things. Infamous people are known for complicated things." Emma considered this. "Which one are you?" "Honestly, I'm not sure yet." They went home and Marcus tried to figure out what to do with a 7-year-old who should be in school but couldn't be because her father had started a war with a corporation. Emma seemed to sense his stress and stayed quiet, reading in her room while Marcus fielded calls and emails. Walsh called at noon. "Have you seen the response?" "Some of it. It's working. Public opinion's shifting. People are asking questions. Sentinel's stock is in freefall. The SEC just announced they're actively investigating allegations of securities violations. That's huge, Hale. They don't announce investigations unless they're planning to prosecute." "What about Garvin?" "Radio silent. He had a statement scheduled for this morning but canceled it. Word is their legal team's in crisis mode trying to figure out how to respond without making it worse." Walsh paused. "You actually did it. You took on a billion-dollar corporation and you're winning." Marcus looked at Emma's closed bedroom door. "Doesn't feel like winning." "Give it time. These things move fast once they start moving." Walsh was right. Over the next 48 hours, the situation escalated in ways Marcus couldn't have predicted. 2 more former Sentinel employees came forward with stories about being forced out after raising concerns about improper trading practices. A competitor firm announced they were reviewing their own dealings with Sentinel. 3 board members resigned. And then Kevin Torres, the compliance analyst who'd given Marcus the flash drive, posted a video on social media describing what he'd found and how his supervisor had told him to ignore it. The video went viral in hours. Sentinel's carefully constructed narrative was collapsing. But Garvin wasn't finished. On the 3rd day after Marcus's interview published, Sentinel filed a lawsuit. Not just against Marcus, against Jennifer Walsh, against the 3 publications that ran the story, against Kevin Torres, seeking damages of $500 million for defamation and corporate espionage. The lawsuit was designed to intimidate, to send a message that fighting back had consequences. Instead, it backfired spectacularly. Legal experts on cable news called it frivolous and desperate. The judge assigned to the case publicly questioned why Sentinel was seeking such extreme damages. And the lawsuit itself became evidence that Sentinel was more concerned with silencing critics than addressing the allegations. Marcus's lawyer, the one he'd queued the automated email to, called him personally. They're panicking. Companies don't file lawsuits like this unless they're trying to regain control of a narrative they've lost, which means you're winning. Winning looks a lot like being sued for $500 million. Trust me, this lawsuit isn't going anywhere, but it does mean they're going to drag this out as long as possible. You need to be prepared for a long fight. Marcus was prepared. He'd been preparing for 5 years. 2 weeks after the story broke, the SEC filed formal charges: securities fraud, insider trading, falsification of corporate records. They named Richard Garvin and 6 other executives, including 3 who'd been directly involved in framing Marcus 5 years ago. The charges were based on Marcus's audit report and evidence the SEC had gathered independently during their ongoing investigation. In the press conference announcing the charges, the SEC director specifically mentioned courageous whistleblowers who risked their careers to expose corruption. Marcus watched the press conference from his apartment with Emma sitting next to him. She didn't understand most of it, but she understood enough. "Does this mean you were right?" she asked. "Yeah, it means I was right. Are the bad people going to jail?" "Maybe, if they're convicted." Emma nodded, satisfied. "Good." The trial took 9 months. Marcus testified for 3 days, walking the jury through everything he'd found during his audit. The prosecution entered thousands of pages of documentation into evidence. Defense lawyers tried to discredit Marcus by bringing up the fraud charges from 5 years ago, but the prosecution countered with the internal memos showing how those charges had been fabricated. By the end, even the defense seemed to know they'd lost. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Richard Garvin was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The other executives received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. Sentinel Capital was fined $800 million and placed under a federal monitor for the next decade. Marcus watched the verdict from the gallery with Emma beside him. She'd missed school for this, and Marcus had decided it was worth it. She needed to see that sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the truth actually mattered. After the verdict, reporters swarmed Marcus on the courthouse steps. He gave a brief statement thanking the prosecutors and the jury, then declined further questions. He and Emma went home and ordered pizza and watched a movie like it was a normal Thursday, because it was. The fight was over. He'd won. And now he had to figure out what came after winning. The settlement from Sentinel's civil suit came 3 months later. Marcus's lawyers had countersued for wrongful termination and defamation based on the fraud charges from 5 years ago. With Garvin convicted and internal memos proving the charges had been fabricated, Sentinel's lawyers knew they couldn't win in court. The settlement was confidential, but it was enough to buy a house with a yard and put money away for Emma's education and never worry about choosing between electricity and groceries again. Marcus bought a small place in a quiet neighborhood with good schools. Emma got her own bedroom for the first time in years. They planted a garden that neither of them knew how to maintain but tried anyway. Life became smaller and quieter and infinitely better than it had been. On Emma's 8th birthday, Marcus took her to the park where they'd spent so many afternoons over the years. They had cake, and she opened presents from friends who came to celebrate with her. Real friends, the kind she'd made at her new school where no one knew or cared about her father's history. After the party, when the other kids had gone home, Emma and Marcus sat on the swings together. "Dad," Emma said, "can I ask you something?" "Always." "Was it worth it? Everything that happened?" Marcus thought about the question. About the 5 years he'd spent planning. About the career he'd lost and the reputation he'd had to rebuild piece by piece. About the nights Emma had gone to bed scared because reporters were camped outside their apartment. About all the ways his choices had affected her life, whether she'd asked for it or not. "I don't know if worth it is the right way to think about it," Marcus said slowly. "It was something I had to do, not because I knew how it would end, but because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try." "Because of the truth thing." "Yeah, because of the truth thing." Emma kicked at the dirt beneath the swing. "I'm glad you did it, even though it was scary sometimes. Because now we have a house, and you don't look sad all the time anymore." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He hadn't realized she'd noticed the sadness. Hadn't realized how much of his pain had leaked into her awareness, despite his efforts to hide it. "I'm glad too," he said quietly. They swung in silence for a while, the evening light turning everything golden. Marcus watched his daughter and thought about the man he'd been 5 years ago, angry, broken, consumed by the need to prove he'd been wronged. That man had achieved what he set out to do, had brought down the people who'd destroyed him, had cleared his name and rebuilt his life. But the victory felt different than he'd imagined. Smaller in some ways, bigger in others. It hadn't erased the pain of what had been done to him, hadn't given him back the years he'd lost, or the innocence Emma had sacrificed because of his choices. What it had given him was something more fundamental. The knowledge that he'd fought for what mattered and refused to let powerful people convince him he was worthless. That he'd stood up when it would have been easier to stay down. That he'd shown his daughter that sometimes the right thing was also the hard thing, and you did it anyway. 3 months after the settlement, Marcus got a call from Jonathan Pierce. They hadn't spoken since the trial ended with Pierce testifying as a prosecution witness about how Garvin had pressured him to fire Marcus before the audit was complete. "I wanted you to know I'm starting a new firm," Pierce said. "Advisory work for companies that actually want legitimate oversight instead of rubber stamps. And I'd like you to join as a partner." Marcus had been consulting independently since the trial, helping other companies audit their systems. Good work that paid well and didn't require him to compromise his integrity. The offer Pierce was making would be a step up. More money, more stability, more respect. "Why me?" Marcus asked. "Because you're the only person I know who actually gives a damn about getting it right. And because I owe you." Pierce paused. "I should have done more to help during the audit. Should have backed you up when Garvin started pushing back. I was protecting my career and I let you fight alone. You forwarded my report to the SEC. That was the least I could do. This is me trying to do more." Marcus thought about it. About building something new with someone who understood both the corruption that existed and the importance of fighting it. About the opportunity to shape how oversight worked instead of just exposing what was broken. "I need to think about it," Marcus said. "Take your time, but I hope you'll say yes." That evening, Marcus talked it over with Emma. She was 8 now, old enough to understand at least some of what the decision meant. "Would we have to move again?" she asked. "No, the firm would be based here. I'd probably travel sometimes, but we'd stay in the house." Emma considered this. "Do you want to do it?" "I think so. It's a chance to build something good, to help make sure what happened to us doesn't happen to other people." "Then you should do it." Emma looked up from the drawing she'd been working on. "You're good at fixing things, Dad. You should fix more things." Marcus smiled. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from the best." He accepted Pierce's offer the next day. Building the firm took time. They started small, just Marcus, Pierce, and 2 other analysts who'd worked on the Sentinel prosecution. They focused on companies that had been burned by their own executives and wanted real accountability. The work was challenging and satisfying and paid well enough that Marcus could actually save money instead of just surviving. Emma thrived. She joined the soccer team at school and discovered she was good at it, made friends who came over for sleepovers and birthday parties, stopped having nightmares about reporters and lawyers and courtrooms. She was just a kid again. Finally, one Saturday afternoon, 2 years after the trial ended, Marcus was cleaning out the garage when he found a box he'd forgotten about. Inside was his father's watch, the one Emma had used for show and tell years ago. Marcus pulled it out and turned it over in his hands, looking at the tarnished brass and scratched crystal. On impulse, he took it to a watch repair shop downtown. The jeweler was an older man who examined it carefully. "This is fixable," he said. "Needs a new movement and some cleaning, but I can restore it. Might take a few weeks." "That's fine. I've waited this long." The jeweler quoted him a price that Marcus would have considered impossible 3 years ago, but could now afford without thinking twice. He agreed and left the watch, feeling like he was leaving behind more than just a broken timepiece. When the watch came back, it looked almost new. The brass had been polished, the crystal replaced, the internal mechanisms restored. Marcus wound it carefully and watched the second hand start moving in smooth, steady circles. That evening, he showed it to Emma. "You fixed it," she said, surprised. "I did." "Does it work now?" Marcus checked the time against his phone. "Perfectly." Emma held out her hand and Marcus gave her the watch. She examined it carefully, the way she examined everything that mattered to her. "You were right," she said. "About what?" "What you told me when I used this for show and tell, that some things are worth fixing even when they're broken, and that fixing them can make them better than they were before." Marcus felt emotion catch in his throat. Yeah, I was right about that. Emma handed the watch back. You should keep this somewhere you can see it, so you remember. Remember what? That you're really good at fixing broken things. Marcus kept the watch on his desk after that, where he could see it every day, a reminder of where he'd been and what he'd learned, that patience and persistence could defeat power, that the truth mattered even when it seemed like nobody cared, that broken things could be restored if you were willing to do the work, and most importantly, that the measure of a person wasn't whether they fell, but whether they got back up and kept fighting for what mattered. Years later, when Emma was in high school and starting to think about colleges, she asked Marcus to help with an essay about someone who'd influenced her life. She chose to write about him, about watching him take on a corporation and win, about learning that courage meant being scared and doing the right thing anyway. Marcus read the essay and cried, which embarrassed Emma until he explained that these were good tears, proud tears. You made it sound more heroic than it was, Marcus said, handing back her laptop. I wrote what I saw, Emma said. What you don't understand is that, from my perspective, watching you refuse to give up when everyone said you were crazy, that was the most important thing I ever learned. That you don't let people tell you who you are. You decide that yourself. Marcus looked at his daughter, no longer the scared 7-year-old who'd slept on an air mattress and worried about whether they'd have enough food. She was 15 now, confident and kind and strong in ways he'd never been at her age. I'm proud of you, he said. I'm proud of you too, Dad, for everything. That was the moment Marcus realized that the victory he'd won wasn't really about Sentinel or Garvin or clearing his name. It was about showing Emma that broken things could be fixed, that fairness was worth fighting for even when the odds were impossible, that power could be challenged by people who refused to accept that might made right. He'd set out to destroy the people who'd destroyed him. What he'd actually done was build a life worth living and raise a daughter who understood that integrity mattered more than comfort. That was the real win. Everything else was just details. Marcus kept working with Pierce's firm, helping companies build systems that actually prevented corruption instead of just catching it after the fact. The work was satisfying in ways his old job had never been. He was building something that mattered, using the skills that had once been turned against him to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Sometimes he thought about Richard Garvin in federal prison, stripped of his power and influence, facing consequences for the first time in his privileged life. Marcus didn't take pleasure in it the way he'd thought he would. Revenge, when you finally got it, turned out to be less satisfying than justice, less personal, more like watching a natural process complete itself than delivering a blow. What mattered wasn't that Garvin had fallen. What mattered was that the system he'd corrupted had been exposed and reformed, that other people wouldn't be destroyed the way Marcus had been, that the work Marcus had done meant something beyond his personal vindication. On the 5-year anniversary of the verdict, Marcus took Emma to visit the courthouse where it had all happened. They stood on the steps where he'd given his statement to reporters, where the trajectory of their lives had changed forever. Do you ever regret it? Emma asked. Going through all of that? Marcus thought about the question, about the price he'd paid and the price Emma had paid alongside him, about the years of fear and struggle and uncertainty, about the nightmares and the panic attacks and the moments when he'd almost given up. No, he said finally, I don't regret it, because if I hadn't done it, I'd still be that person, the one who let them win, the one who taught you that powerful people always get away with it, and there's no point fighting back. And now? Now I'm someone who fought back and won, and you're someone who knows that the world isn't fair, but it can be made more fair if you're willing to do the work. Emma nodded, accepting this. Good, because I'm thinking about law school, corporate law maybe, or prosecution, something where I can do what you did but with a law degree behind it. Marcus felt pride swell in his chest. You'd be good at that. I learned from the best. They stood on the courthouse steps together, father and daughter, survivors of a war that had tested them both and left them stronger for it. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, and Marcus thought about how far they'd come from that small apartment with the broken heat and the constant fear. They'd built something better. Not perfect. Nothing was ever perfect. But good. Real. Worth the price they'd paid. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. A life lived with integrity, A daughter who understood what mattered, a future built on truth instead of lies. Marcus Hale had set out to destroy an empire and clear his name. What he'd actually done was something more fundamental and more important. He'd proven that one person could make a difference, that truth could prevail over power if you were patient enough and brave enough and stubborn enough to see it through. He'd won not just a verdict but a lesson, not just vindication but wisdom. And in teaching Emma that lesson, he'd given her something worth more than any settlement or any revenge, the knowledge that she could face anything and survive it, that she could fight back against forces that seemed overwhelming and actually win. That was the real legacy, not the headlines or the verdict or the money. The legacy was a daughter who knew her worth, and a father who'd shown her that broken things could be made whole again if you cared enough to do the work. Marcus put his arm around Emma's shoulders, and they walked down the courthouse steps together, heading home.